going to be hard for you to see the chat, Alex.
Great. Perfect.
Cool. All right. We are going to get started. So welcome to Trauma 101, Principles of Trauma-Informed Yoga. All right.
I'm going to go in before we start. I'm going to ask everyone to just make sure you're muted. And then if you want to, if we have group wisdom or have any questions, feel free to use the chat or put your hand up, and then we can kind of navigate from there.
Awesome. Cool. Let's get into it. All right, we're going to start today with a lineage and land acknowledgement. So everything, literally, well, most everything. We're going to share some things anecdotally from our own experiences, but the actual wisdom of yoga and mindfulness practices come to us from our teachers and their teachers and their teachers. I have a lot of teachers, so it would take a long time to acknowledge it. I would say there are certain teachers that had big impacts, like Matthew Sanford had a big impact on my chair practices and kind of making the practices more accessible. Catherine Thomas, who many of you know, definitely impacted my thinking on trauma-informed, as did Susanna Barkataki, who I did my 300-hour with, and other nonprofits I've worked with, and all of the wisdom coming from India, the mindfulness practices coming from other parts of Asia. So like much love to the roots of all of these practices that were not invented by us. And land acknowledgement, I am coming to you from Boynton Beach, Florida, from Haga land. And I like to take a moment just before we get started, ground your feet or your body, however you're sitting, take a moment to just sit on the earth and be with all the people that came before you on this land, that were raising babies and finding food, acknowledging their traumas and our traumas, because these are not individual things, these are collective things as well. And expanding that not just to awareness, but also gratitude. Gratitude to the land we're on, to our teachers, every single one that has influenced you along your journey that brings you here today. All right, my friends, thank you for sharing that moment with us. And we're going to start our practice as we very commonly, maybe many of us on here start some of our classes, which is the Yoga for Recovery meditation. So some of you that work with other groups that aren't working with this particular curriculum, this may be new. There was once upon a time where we had to stay very narrowly within the script because we were doing research, and research requires very, very controlled variables. But now, we have a little bit more freedom to use it or not, and to kind of put our own voice into it a bit more. So this is my version of our Yoga for Recovery meditation. So as we get started, find a comfortable posture. If you are someone that prefers to not be on camera when you're meditating, that's cool. Nobody's required to be on camera. This is your choice. So settle in where it feels comfortable. You can practice with eyes open or eyes closed. And we'll take a couple of breaths together. So inhale fully into your belly. Exhale and sigh. Another full inhale. Long sigh. One more just like that. Inhale and sigh. Now allow your breath to fall into a natural rhythm. Effortlessly in through your nose and out through your nose. Without trying to control your breath, bring your full awareness to the sensation of breathing. Maybe that's the sensation of air passing over your nostrils. Maybe it's slightly cooler on your inhales and warmer on your exhales. Notice the rise and fall of your ribs and belly. Thoughts and distractions may happen. When you notice that you're thinking, there's no need to judge yourself. Simply return your attention to the sensation of breathing. Every return to the breath is a return to the present moment. The past is memory, the future is imagination. The only place we can truly, physically exist is this very moment with this very breath. Now start to shift your awareness to physical sensation where your body makes contact with what's supporting it. Notice the points of contact, the solidness of the ground or the chair. Notice the weight of your hands wherever they're resting. And then see if you can feel your heart beating. Maybe you even look for the furthest place from your heart that you can feel your pulse. Gently shifting your awareness to sounds, starting with whatever you can hear that's furthest away. And you hear something outside of the space you're in, either outdoors or in another room. And then shifting your awareness closer to the sound of my voice. And finally, the sound of your own inhales and exhales. Attention to breath, physical sensations, and sounds are all anchors to the present moment. And these grounding tools are available to us within this time together and also out in the world whenever we might need them. Now take a moment to notice your emotional state without judging. Notice if it feels any different than when you first sat down to be here today. Now take a moment to notice if there's a physical sensation in your body connected to one of these emotions. So, for me, as someone who experiences all kinds of big feelings, I notice I feel anxiety, is tightness in my belly, in my neck and shoulders. Whereas when I feel depression, it feels like all of my limbs are made out of concrete and it's hard to move. Joy feels warmer and lighter. So, whatever you're feeling today, notice it, notice where it's living, give it a name, and then let it be. You don't have to do anything about it. We'll bring our attention back to our breath and invite in a feeling of gratitude. And it can be for anything at all, whatever that word brings up for you in this moment. So take a deep breath in, filling up with gratitude. Exhale, send it out. Again, inhaling gratitude, imagine it like warmth expanding around your heart. Exhale, send it out. One more, inhaling gratitude and exhaling gratitude. Stay with that feeling for a moment and take a moment to reflect right now on how you're feeling and what brought you here. A little self check-in. And then whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes and we will check in as a group. All right. How are we feeling, my friends? All right. I know that's a meditation that some of you might be super familiar with. It sometimes feels weird to hear it in someone else's voice. So any reflections, and you can reflect by either unmuting or typing into the chat, any reflections on what that experience is like on the receiving end?
You're right. I've been hearing it from my own voice for a while now, and I miss hearing it in your voice because when I did your IT support every week, I would hear it in your voice. So that was fantastic. Thank you.
Aw, I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
So for me, which I think only Forrest knows this, who's here right now, I actually came into Yoga for Change from the opposite side of Yoga for Change. I was at Coalition Recovery, and Susie and Matilda were my teachers. So I haven't experienced it said to me since I was in like active recovery. Oh, so many emotions, but it was really beautiful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I love that. That is a beautiful story. Thank you. Samantha, I think I saw your hand up too.
Yes. So I haven't heard that. I used to say that one all the time, and it was so nice to receive it after being away from it for a long time. I remember I was teaching so many classes online during the beginning of the pandemic. So to like hear it and receive it just made me remember how much I love this practice and appreciate this space so much. Like my heart is so full. I was like crying. So thank you.
Thank you. Those are beautiful shares. All right, my friends, that was super cool. We will continue on and talk about some objectives of today's practice. So, or not practice, workshop, whatever you want to call it, space. So today we're going to be exploring the impact of trauma and adversity on the brain and nervous system. So we are going to get into some sciencey stuff about brain biology and neuroplasticity. If you are not a science geek, do not fear. It won't be scary science. It's accessible science. But we will talk about it because it's important to understand sort of the mechanics and the why of what's going on. And I liken it to like driving a car. It is super helpful to have some basic knowledge of how cars work, because then you know whether you're out of gas or you have a dead battery. You need to know some very basic stuff, even if you don't want to be a mechanic. Nobody needs to be a mechanic, but knowing some basic stuff on how our bodies operate is important. All right. We're also going to talk about the foundational principles of trauma-informed care as it applies to the work we do. So trauma-informed care principles can apply to like literally anything. They can apply to education and healthcare and organizations and government entities. They can apply to literally anything. We're going to focus specifically on our classes and what we do. And then we're going to compare demonstrations of yoga and mindfulness techniques from a trauma-informed perspective. So we've already done one. We've already done one of actually two technically, because we did a lineage and land acknowledgement, and we did, our first meditation together. So we're going to be doing some more of those. So hopefully it stays pretty interactive. I want to pause and just say, whenever having conversations about trauma, there is the possibility of stuff to be activated. Many of us come to this work because we have our own experiences with trauma. That is a super, common thing many of us share. So you know yourself the best. Take care of yourself. If at some time you feel like dysregulated and it's not good and your brain is kind of shutting down, pause you can reach out to Alex and I, either one, via the chat and kind of let us know we're in this together. So, one of us can, take an aside to like talk to you if that's what's helpful. Or if you don't need a connection with us and just need to go take a walk outside, like barefoot in the grass, cool, go get some water, like whatever it is you need to take care of yourself, just be mindful that that's okay. Like that's not just okay, but that's important to do your own self-care practices. All right, cool. All right, we're gonna watch, I think maybe it's like the first 6-ish minutes of this, Alex. We don't have to watch the whole thing. Has anybody seen this video? Like either raise your hand or thumbs up. The Nadine Burke-Harris. Okay, so we've got a mix, maybe a couple of you. So Nadine Burke-Harris was the Surgeon General for the state of California until fairly recently. She actually had her own burnout situation that was happening, and she stepped away for self-care. So she is someone that like doesn't just talk the talk, she walks the walk. So she stepped away from her role, but her focus in California was specifically around childhood adversity, trauma as well, but primarily childhood adversity. So we are going to watch the first half of this. She is amazing. Absolutely.
She is quite phenomenal.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease.
I don't know about anyone else to do.
And yet they are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities, access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC. And together, they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
Thank you. All right. If you have time, I definitely encourage you to watch the full video. It starts to get into a little bit more of like what doctors should do, which is out of our focus area, but the whole thing is amazing and she's amazing. And if you have not read her book, The Deepest Well, I would encourage it. It goes into more depth on her life, and part of what drove her focus is having a mother with schizophrenia. So she kind of gets into her lived experience, as well as, you know, what she saw front lines with the children and families that she was working with. So it's really amazing. We're going to shift from here into ACEs. And I know that the first link that I put there did not work. So don't fret if you tried that and it didn't work. Use the second link. So there's two different surveys, identified and de-identified, and it kind of doesn't really matter for us. That just means like whether somebody has their name on it or not. So use the second link that says questionnaire for adults, de-identified. But just to acknowledge, you can start taking that. But when we're talking about ACEs, it's in these specific categories. It's not all trauma. There's a lot of trauma out in the universe that is not an adverse childhood experience, even though it may be experienced by children. So ACEs are specific physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then specific household dysfunctions. So having caregivers with mental illness, people in the home who are incarcerated. This on the screen, it says mother treated violently. It can be any kind of domestic violence issue. So it could also be, you know, it could be any caregivers that are being treated violently, not just moms. Substance use and divorce, or any kind of disconnection from a parent. So it could also be, you know, just a caregiver that was not known. That still is one of those categories. So go ahead and take the ACE survey real quick. That is in the chat. Does everybody see that? I know we have some people that are newish to Zoom. Can everyone see? If you cannot, you can unmute and I'll try to direct you to the chat.
I'm on my iPad, so I can't seem to get it to pull up as a survey.
It might be one of the, it's not an actual, you just, like the link will just pull up a screen. It's not like interactive where you're.
Oh, okay. So we're just counting
just counting them. Exactly.
Okay.
Just counting them. Sorry, I should have explained that a little bit better. So yeah, it's just those 10 questions, and you're counting how many of these apply to you. And if it's helpful, you can keep a little tally on the side, whatever works for you. And these are experiences prior to your 18th birthday. So anytime in your childhood. And if you haven't taken, even if you've taken this before, go ahead and take it again. They're all worded. It's supposed to be standardized, but I find that sometimes the wording varies just a small smidgen, that for me affects my my ACE score. So we want to start kind of all from one place. And nobody's going to be pressured to share this, but it's just helpful to know it. All right. And if once you are done, if you could either use a reaction or an actual thumb to just let me know that you're finished. All right. Still have a couple people still working, so no worries. All right. All right, I think we can go. So have any of you, for one thing, is this new to anybody? Is this your first time taking an ACE survey? I'm gonna expand so I can see more of your faces. Okay. So many of us maybe have taken this before. I find even I've taken it kind of lots of times. I'm also in graduate school working on my social work degree. So yes, if I've been in those kind of environments, even outside of Yoga for Change, some of us working in mental health may have taken it. And I'm starting to see it more often, like my kid's pediatrician actually use this. I've had some other doctors that have used this recently. I went to my OB/GYN and they had an ACE survey as part of the intake paperwork. So it is definitely more present out there and there's more awareness. It's important for a couple reasons. One is to know our own score is important because the higher your ACE score, there's going to be a higher likelihood, not higher likelihood, a higher risk factor for things like vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, like all of the stuff that happens in doing the work that we do. If you're on that higher end, you know, like, and I don't mean high, like 8 is like off the charts, but if you're in the category of like 3 or more, if you're in a 3 or more category, be aware that there are some additional risk factors for you in working with individuals impacted by trauma. So that's one reason to keep it in mind. Also, keep in mind that most of the individuals that we work with in our programming, this is stuff that has impacted them. And part of that trauma-informed perspective is thinking like not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And this is part of building that what happened to you structure. So the majority of people, like this whole big survey, we know that the majority of people have one, like at least one. That's what which is important to know because that means the majority of people have some sort of trauma. The percentages go down and 4 to 5, I want to say it's like maybe 25% of people have 4 or more. Most people, you know, okay. So we were doing this work, that may be true. Yeah, that may be true. Like most people, I know. It's funny because, you know, I'm working on a clinical social work degree, and whenever we take these in classes and I have people that are like, I have 0. I'm like, how do you have 0? And you're going to be like a social worker. Like, how did you even end up in this field? But they are out there. They're out there. So yeah, once you hit like 4 or more, that's when a lot of the health stuff comes up. And that's why it's important to be aware for self-care purposes. But for the people that we're working with, because we know there's an impact of ACEs on things like substance use and incarceration and all of those things. Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely share. There's other ACEs out there. That website is really good. There's a lot more information on there. So definitely share it wherever you can share it. That's a bit of an introduction on ACEs. Any questions or any other insights before we move on? Okay, cool. So it's important to keep in mind that what they call the pair of ACEs. So those are those adverse childhood experiences. Those are individual experiences. The original study was with well-educated, middle-class white people, to be honest. So like that was the original study. Obviously they've expanded it now and there's a lot more populations that have participated, but that was the original study. They are now looking at like, okay, those are individual experiences in conjunction with adverse community environments. So a lot of like the work that Nadine Burke-Harris did was with poor neighborhoods, where poverty had a huge impact, and food deserts and all those other factors. So if you have a high ACE score and an environment that is an easy average environment, is going to be a different situation than if you have a high ACE score and in addition to that you're in an adverse environment where there's poverty, where there's violence, where you're kind of always afraid that there could be like bullets flying through your walls. Like those kinds of things are going to affect what's going on in your system. So it's important to keep both of those in mind, especially like, we use this screening in mental health when we get a low number, but like the kid is in an environment where there's like a lot of community violence. We don't say like, oh, they have a low number, they're going to be fine. We have to keep in mind like, oh, there's other traumas going on and we still want to keep that trauma informed perspective. So that's a little bit on that. All right. So let's just give a definition of trauma that we all can kind of agree to kind of follow this particular definition. And it's individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So trauma is not the event or circumstances themselves. It's how the individual reacts to that. So depending on what kind of protective factors are in place, two people can experience what seems like on paper a very similar circumstance or event, and one can have the traumatic responses going on in their body and in their system, and the other one doesn't. And it's not that individual's fault. That's not what it's about. It's not like, oh, I'm more resilient than the other person. Often, what we say is resilience is really just a circumstance. Some people have different circumstances, different supports in place that protect them from the impacts of the event and protect them from experiencing it as trauma. Any questions on this or thoughts or, okay. All right, next slide. So oftentimes people think they kind of interchange trauma and PTSD when they're two different situations. So PTSD is a specific diagnosis where we're talking about symptoms that can happen as a result of trauma. They don't necessarily, not everyone with trauma has PTSD. Everyone with PTSD has trauma, but not everyone with trauma has PTSD. So the specific experiences of PTSD, things like re-experiencing the event as flashbacks, avoiding things that are reminders of the event, feeling emotionally numb. So that detachment, shutting down, being disengaged, recurrent unwanted memories, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, or negative perceptions of others. So, the persistent intrusive thoughts of all those different kinds. Memory problems, and we'll get into a little bit of the brain later and talk about why that happens. Always being on guard or easily startled, so that hypervigilance, someone has that real strong startle reflex. Trouble concentrating, also a brain thing we'll talk about, and overwhelming guilt or shame. So like how they think about themselves, irritability, aggression, and anger. So these are specific PTSD symptoms. The reason that we cover this is because we want to be careful not to use trauma and PTSD interchangeably. And that, not that we're yoga teachers, even those of you who are working in mental health in your Yoga for Change capacity, we're yoga teachers, so we're not diagnosing. And, we may sometimes encounter someone that says, I have PTSD. And so we kind of are aware in our brains that this is some of the stuff that they're dealing with. Does that make sense? Okay, next slide. All right, so trauma is complicated. It can be as a result of lots of different things. So it could be one single event that causes that trauma response. Could be something like a natural disaster, some kind of sexual trauma, single event. It could be a car accident. It could be like medical trauma. There's lots of single events. When we think about what happened in Parkland, I'm working like down the street from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas right now. And the kids there had a single event trauma. That is one variety of trauma. It's not the only variety. We also have complex trauma. So when Nadine Burke-Harris was talking about the bear that comes home, that's home every day, like to constantly be afraid of that bear, that's a complex trauma. So when we're thinking about high ACE scores, that's a complex trauma situation. Vicarious and secondary trauma, I'm going to kind of talk about together. So they're a little bit different, but vicarious trauma, meaning someone is telling you about a traumatic experience, or you're exposed to the environments where a lot of people have traumatic experiences. And so then even though you've not had that experience, there's an impact, that vicarious impact. And it could be like first responders, very commonly vicarious trauma is something that happens. They're exposed to that. Vicarious trauma can also happen by seeing pictures like that. There's a lot of ways that vicarious trauma can happen. Secondary trauma is actually, the full name of it is secondary traumatic stress. And that is when you actually get those PTSD symptoms that we covered on the last screen. Those symptoms happen as a result of being exposed to someone else's trauma. So that's how those are a little bit different. So early on working in mental health, I didn't know how to set boundaries properly. And so I was working individually, mentoring a client, and our first meeting, she had what they sometimes unofficially call a trauma dump. She had never talked to someone that she trusted, and she did a trauma dump, meaning that she went into very, very explicit details about a traumatic experience that had happened to her. And I was unprepared because it was our first meeting, and usually a first meeting is like you get to know each other and it's pretty chill. And I was also newish. This was several years ago, and I didn't know how to set boundaries, and I didn't know that could impact me. So what that trauma dump did, because the details were so specific, is that I had nightmares about it. It felt like it happened to me, like I could see it happening. And I would get like pervasive thoughts about it. So I had some of those PTSD symptoms that it's something that it felt like it happened to me. Like that's the only way I can describe it, because it was detailed. And also there was enough similarity in our experiences. Anyone that has some stuff, that's why we're at a higher risk. So it was easy for me to put myself in her place, because even though I had not had that experience at all, it wasn't exactly like my experience. I'd had some close enough experiences where it was not hard to place myself there. It is not a good thing. We do not want to have vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress, especially because if we're then experiencing these PTSD symptoms, that makes us not as helpful as helpers in other capacities. So I had to see a therapist about it. I had to really work through it. And that's something that can happen. So we just want to be really, really cautious. And I think especially in our classes, I have had people that have shared stuff. They've never, not to that capacity, but you just want to be cautious, know yourself. And if someone starts to get into some details, sometimes you do have to be firm. You want to have them connected and like acknowledge like I'm so like honored that you like trust me. I also like let's be cautious to not open up something that we aren't going to be able to close. And that's part of the problem, because we're there as for this very small amount of time. And we aren't really going to be able to fully address someone's trauma. And it's also not our role in the work that we do. All right, I saw a hand go up and then I lost it. Did somebody have a question? Yes, no, it's okay to ask if you have questions.
I did. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I guess I was trying to I wanted to follow up with what you said, and how do you with I guess in a lovingly, or how do you ask for that exchange to stop so you don't get the trauma dump?
Yeah,
because you want to appear not appear. I mean, we do what we do because we're sympathetic, and we.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we're more vulnerable to this sort of thing. The way that I do it, I always kind of like make sure they know that I hear, like I put my hands on my heart, like, so like they know that this is meaningful. And I usually thank them and say like, thank you. Like, I am honored that you trust me with this. And I want to be just totally honest that I don't, it's important to me not to cause either one of us harm. And if we get into details of trauma, it can be harmful. And then I might ask them, is there someone, a lot of the work we do is in facilities. So I might ask them, is there someone here that you can work through some of this with? And because my training background in mental health was as a peer specialist, like I am able to talk about my own stuff, like, and say like, I have had to work through lots of trauma, and like going through trauma therapy has helped me immensely. And I might acknowledge that and the heaviness of it. And also that it can be harmful to open up something that we're not able to close together, and just be honest that we're not able to do that. And it wouldn't be responsible to continue a conversation. Make sure that the way you're communicating is that it is for their, like, you genuinely care about their well-being, and that you want to do what's right for their well-being. And then if you are in a facility, you know, you may want to just touch base with whoever your contact is there to let them know, hey, this person may need some additional support. And that's part of why we do this training, because yoga is a body thing, and trauma is stored in your body. Sometimes things do surface. And so that's why we want to be aware. We want to stay in our lane. We are in this role as, you know, mindfulness yoga teachers. Like that's what we're doing. We're not in here to be trauma therapists. And that's why it's important we have these trainings, so that we define our portion of it, and know that when we see some of these symptoms, that we have them connected with the appropriate resources. Does anyone else, I know a lot of you have a lot of experience. Does anybody else want to share what has worked for you? I probably got too far into this. Like, we're going to get more into the later slides, but like, it's okay. The later slides will go a little faster.
I can offer a little bit of sharing, just because I work with at-risk youth. So obviously many of these kids are in chaotic situations. I've had many of them, you know, come up and just need hugs. And some of them have asked me to adopt them. Some of them are afraid to go back to a new foster home because they've been abused in a different foster home. And what we can, or what I do is just say, well, for as long as you are here, I will commit to showing up on Wednesdays for you. You can count on me to be here. And if you ever need a hug, I can offer that, you know, and just, I let them know what I can offer to them, instead of saying, oh no, I can't help you, like no, or this, or like,
you know, they're always available to share, but I remind them of what I can offer. And then that might be a good thing, because they're not leaving you empty-handed or dismissed or with nothing, or kind of shut down, or like, oh, you can't meet my need. It's like, here are the things that I can offer. And then
Yeah.
they know what they can come to you for. You can always get a hug. You can always tell me how you're feeling. You can always make a request on what you may need in this yoga class. Maybe you need to relax today. Maybe you need to move today. So I'm here to hear what you need from yoga. I'm here to listen. I'm here for hugs, those kinds of things. So offering what you can give has been helpful with working with kids.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Focusing on what you can do is helpful. Somebody else, I think, had a hand up. That was awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Christian.
Yeah, if I can, Amanda. So mine was, and it's, I mean, there's similar situations all around, but the recent one I had, it was with a veterans class that was right after a 12-step meeting. And this was, and I knew he was new. And a lot of times with this group that we had, if they were new, they were pretty much almost like it was either this program or going into a treatment facility. So some of them even, you know, kind of not with it. So I don't know if this guy thought we were going into another 12-step meeting, but he started just kind of talking about his experience and what brought him there. And I just was like, you know, well, I appreciate you sharing that and opening up to be able to do that. And hopefully what I offer today gives you some relief.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, awesome.
really just, it kind of goes into specific, it kind of just reiterates what, and I forgot her name that was just speaking. I do apologize. But that's what we're trying to do. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, and maybe you don't call it relief. Maybe you call it something totally other than that. But that's where you bring your slice or your twist to this magic. So
Yeah.
but yeah, and we kind of, and the cool thing about that class was there was a staff there, so I didn't need to kind of go to somebody and say, hey, but you know, I want to reiterate that as well, is that because I do teach for a wellness program and they have clinicians on site. So if there is something specific that pops out in my class, I don't need to address it with the student, because I can just say kind of, hey, and normally 9 times out of 10, because this wellness program is so, I mean, they've been doing it so long, they're like, okay, we know about that. And, you know, I don't have to do anything else. So
Yeah.
it goes back to reiterate, you know, we're here to teach yoga and meditation, period.com.
Yeah, I think that does help. What can you do? Like, we can offer skills for regulation. We can offer space for rest. You know, we there's a lot that we can offer, you know, and, you know, we aren't in a, we need to be honest that we aren't able to process details of trauma with them, because honestly, it's just not, it's not healthy for them or for us. And we care about their well-being. Being genuine is important, like your authentic self. So it's going to sound different in your voice. Like each of us is going to have different words that are essentially, you know, kind of going to be focused on the same thing. And I think we have one more. Okay, we have a couple more questions. So Larissa, what was your additional question?
Yeah, let me hold that for a moment and maybe reconnect later on, because I don't want to waste anybody's time. And,
okay.
Kind of,
yeah, no worries.
So,
okay.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone. And
yeah.
yes,
and we will get into a little bit more on some of this stuff later. So if it's still bubbling in there, we're going to circle back.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So other types of trauma, I'm going to go through a little faster. Attachment. And attachment has to do with child caregiver attachment, and we carry it on to adulthood. So like the relationship you had with your, you know, caregivers, you know, it affects how we relate to other people, you know, throughout life. So that's one of the types of trauma. And then generational and epigenetic, which are a little bit different. Sometimes people confuse them. Generational means, like, a common example, like if somebody's like, I was raised getting spankings, and so I'm gonna spank my children, and like, so you pass on like your, you know, traumas down the line to next generation. So that is generational trauma. Whatever it is that you experienced, you just sort of replicate. Like, you'll see that with like things like, you know, alcohol and substances, you know, different child rearing practices, like a lot of that you'll see passed down from one generation to the next. Epigenetic is different. Epigenetic refers to what's happening at a cellular level when someone experiences trauma. Even if they don't pass the behaviors on, even if they never meet their offspring. And it originally came about when they were studying Holocaust survivors and their descendants. And they found that even if there was no mention of the Holocaust, so no mention, nothing, even if they didn't even meet these descendants, children and grandchildren still at a cellular level had impacts of those traumas. So that's the epigenetic trauma. It's the stuff that's going on in our DNA. Side note on epigenetic trauma is that there is also epigenetic resilience. And I find that really hopeful, because if any of you have like ancestors that went through major stuff, it is helpful to know that, yes, you know, epigenetic trauma is a thing. It passes on in our cells. It's like now in our DNA that we're passing on to our children. And when you work on healing that trauma, that also can be passed on to your children and their children. And when I talk about healing trauma, it's not like learning how to regulate your system. So when we talk about like all the responses, the trauma responses that Nadine Burke-Harris was talking about, so like the sympathetic nervous system being activated and you're like constantly in this dysregulated state, your ability to like learn how to regulate this so you're not always dysregulated can be passed on to your kiddos, so they aren't born as dysregulated or their kiddos or like whoever down the line. So that's kind of the difference between those two, generational and epigenetic trauma. All right, next slide, Alex. So a lot, especially when we're talking about youth, but even in all of our populations, a lot of times we're talking about complex trauma. So it's something that occurs repeatedly. It's not the single event stuff. It's the stuff that's happening over and over again. So exposure to this prolonged like maltreatment, neglect, abuse, the cumulative effect raises the rates of substance use. It raises all kinds of mental health conditions and physical health conditions. Like it impacts people long-term when it's that complex trauma, because it's that system that's going into overdrive repeatedly to where your nervous system then is expecting this stuff and it's just becomes very sensitive. All right, next slide. And so we went into this like way more than expected earlier, but just to that's like we gave the definition of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. The reason we spend so much time on this is because we want you all to be well also. Like we want to be of service, we want to support, you know, all of the populations we serve. And, you know, we need to be aware of our own traumas, because if you get repeated vicarious trauma, you start doing these things, if you get burnt out, you are not going to be of service in your classes. You're not going to be able to show up the way that you really want to show up. And so it's really important that we are clear on our roles, that we're clear on boundaries, that we have practices to kind of discharge that energy. It's really important to like whatever your grounding practices are for after, you know, classes or other places that you're exposed to people who've experienced trauma, like grounding is important. So if you find yourself where you're like, okay, I teach 10 classes a week and I go from this to this to this, like that's going to increase your risk of some of these impacts. So you really taking the time to like let it let it go and practice some kind of self-care after your classes is going to be important.
And I do want to add on something to this that my teacher taught me, and something that we might already be practicing, but those teachers that have just received their certification, and this goes in trauma-informed yoga, but also externally in whatever else you're doing. My teacher taught me that however many classes you're teaching a week, it would be it's something that you might want to look into doing the same amount of classes and practicing yourself, whether that's a yoga practice or a meditation practice or a breathing technique. But if you're teaching 10, 11, 12 classes a week, you should be practicing, should be, is that, like life happens. So it doesn't always happen that way, but it is very common if you're teaching that many classes, that you might get burnt out a lot quicker. You might start to notice these effects, or that you're taking on these traumas, vicarious or secondary, quicker than if you were, like Amanda said, expelling this energy in a way that works for you. That might not even be a yoga practice, but something that's going to keep you inspired, something that's going to keep you feeling like you're at your best self, whether that's writing or, whatever that case may be. So a ratio 1-to-1, one class to one self-care practice. So just wanted to add that in there as well.
I think that's really helpful. And I think it's helpful that, Alex, that you opened it up to other stuff. Because I remember being early on, like, how am I ever going to have time to go take 10 yoga classes a week? And when I examined my practices, I was doing that much self-care. It just wasn't necessarily taking yoga classes. It was maybe I did have little practices, yoga practices for like 15 minutes here or there. And I would be out in the garden, and I would walk on the beach, and I had other self-care practices when I really sat with it, like, oh, I am doing this. I'm just not doing it in this kind of same defined way. So you know yourself, you are the expert of your experience. You know what helps you recharge. It is important to incorporate those practices. Cannot be reiterated enough. All right. Thanks, Alex. All right. We're going to talk about the brain, and it's important, because it does impact our brains. This is not a super heavy one, and it will help us all kind of start brain stuff.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain, as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions, including emotion, behavior, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behavior. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator, or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
Cool. All right. So that introduces us to trauma and how it affects like the major components of the brain and nervous system. So sometimes we like think of it as the brain, but it's the brain and nervous system. So your nervous system, although this is kind of in charge of it is throughout your body. And that's why we think of, not this that we think of, but trauma is held in your nervous system. So it is in your whole body, you know, including your brain. So as we go to the next slide, how this might show up is
the hand model's not in here, but this goes into the impacts. So if you want to, I can stop here.
Okay. No, that's fine. So I'm going to show it what can be helpful for me. And as they mentioned, I don't know if you caught on that little blip, it said, it mentioned psychoeducation is an intervention in itself. When we share information about how this stuff works, we are empowering individuals because knowledge is power, and we're empowering them to understand. It can be such a huge relief for someone to realize that, you know, it's not like something's wrong with them. This is natural biology. Larissa, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think I really like the fact that you touched on it. I just wanted to make a quick comment, if you don't mind. Yeah. Also, just to, a lot of times I think that as like us older adults, we don't give enough regard to that type of brain biology when we're teaching teenagers, because what needs to be kept in mind is, as you know, from all the research and everything else, the teenage brain is not, prefrontal cortex is not developed yet. So even though this person may look like bigger than you, and they may look like they are an adult, they're still a child. So when we look at a 13-year-old that maybe is bigger than you, we still need to treat them and give them regard as a child who's probably planning is not as sophisticated as a 12-year-old, you know, because their brain is fully flooded with all the hormones that
Yeah.
was previously mentioned. So sorry to kind of elaborate that on a little bit, but I think it, even besides trauma, if we just keep in mind that this is who we're in front of.
Yeah, that's super helpful when thinking about youth. And for me, something that's helpful to remember some of this brain stuff, and also an easy way to share it, is the hand model of the brain that I'm going to explain. And this is going to be, there's also a video on a later slide. We're going to share the slideshow with you so you can refer back to this if you forget it, because sometimes your brain gets full of information and can't store everything. But a brief hand model of the brain. So just like we talked about in the video, it would take 2 hemispheres. It would take 2 hands to make a full brain, but I'm just going to do 1 hemisphere at a time. So if we use this as a model of the brain, so this is back here, brain stem is your wrist. And so they talked about that brain stem being kind of that like very primitive part that's in charge of like your heart rate and breathing and like basic digestion, survival level stuff. That is just keeping you alive. And that connects directly with the interior of the brain called the limbic system. And the limbic system, like they reviewed, that's where your amygdala is, that little smoke alarm. They showed the alarm going off is in your limbic system. Sometimes they call it mammalian brain or emotional brain. So you have limbic system and brainstem. You can collectively think of those as downstairs brain. It is just in charge of keeping you alive and survival. Wrapped around the limbic system is your cortex. So limbic system is inside, cortex wraps around, and connected to it in the front is your prefrontal cortex. So like Larissa was talking about how adolescents, teens, children, their prefrontal cortex is not done developing. That's true. It doesn't finish until you're 25. Also, people who have experienced trauma have had the experience of that smoke alarm going off over and over again. So like Nadine Burke-Harris talked about coming home to the bear every day. So this is always what we say, flipping the lid. Flipping the lid means turning off your prefrontal cortex. Your thinking brain goes offline when your survival brain is in charge. And if you've ever seen someone or yourself experienced road rage, that is what it looks like. So there's like, what are they thinking? What are they thinking? They are not thinking. That is what's happening. The survival brain, downstairs brain, limbic system, all this stuff is in charge because they're in their feelings, they're in survival mode, and this is offline. So what we know about mindfulness practices is that every time we do something like name an emotion, that brings the prefrontal cortex online. Every time we come back to the present moment, prefrontal cortex. Every time we pause and say like, oh, I'm feeling dysregulated, that's prefrontal cortex. So the way I explain it to kiddos is like, we're doing push-ups with our brain. They like doing push-ups. I don't know. That's what works for in my experience. Like we're doing brain push-ups. And even, some adults do like brain push-ups. Every single time we practice noticing and naming and observing emotions, we are exercising that prefrontal cortex. And that's one of those things that over time, even if you have a very overactive limbic system, you got an amygdala that's always like going off, over time, you can actually make noticeable differences in the structure of these components of the brain, which is super exciting. Like, yes, it sucks to have complex trauma and have an overactive, downstairs brain, and we get to change it. We get to make impact. And that's what we're doing. That's why we're here, is to help with those skills for doing brain push-ups. Cool. Can you go back to the slide for just a second? I don't know if how you may see this overactive limbic system might look like decreased impulse control because the prefrontal cortex is not is not in charge. It's this impulsive survival brain. You might see decreased ability to reason. Same, thinking brain is not online, the way that we would hope. Emotions being the action driver. If you go through all of these, you can trace all of these back to the relationship between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So it's not like people are just choosing to be impulsive. It's biology, and letting them sharing the information that this biology that was intended to keep them safe is the reason some of these things are happening can be a huge relief. And that's what I have heard so much, is that, it's like a light bulb, like, this isn't my fault. This is just my brain was trying to keep me safe. And that's why I've had trouble controlling my impulses or whatever. All right. Thoughts, questions? Cool. All right, now we get to go into research, and we won't spend a super long time here, but you will get the slideshow with this information. Basically, there is a ton of research, especially on mindfulness, less on yoga, some, but especially on mindfulness and how, because of neuroplasticity, which neuroplasticity, it just means that brains can change. Brains can change. That's exciting stuff. Because of doing these brain push-ups using mindfulness techniques, it has a true impact on symptoms, structure, imaging, all the things. So next slide, we're just going to touch on a couple of them. A meta-analysis just means they pulled together a whole bunch of studies rather than just one study. It's like they're pulling together a ton of research. But basically, they pulled together 185 studies, and they had encouraging results for yoga. So this doesn't include our study, and we're going to get into that in a minute, but basically showing positive impact on things like PTSD symptoms, on all the things having to do with regulation. The reason it says encouraging but preliminary, because even though it sounds like a lot, there's still a lot more to do to control the different variables. It's hard. Research is hard. And this is a tricky one, especially when we're talking about like symptoms, because most of this is based on self-reports. And so it's looking good so far. And, it's not considered a replacement for therapy. It's considered to be very, helpful tools, especially regarding regulation of the nervous system. That's loud. Sorry. All right, next slide. Mindfulness in trauma has a lot more data, and it's a lot more regimented. And part of that is most of it uses MBSR. Are you familiar with MBSR? It's mindfulness-based stress reduction. So it's a very structured curriculum, and it's 8 weeks. And it's honestly, I took an MBSR class recently because I wanted to see what it was like, and it was intense, friends. It was a lot. It was like a 3-hour class every week and like hours of homework every day. It was a lot. So it makes sense that they get some really good results from this, because it's a pretty big commitment. They saw, like I said about the other, like a significant impact in many of the PTSD symptoms, not all of them. So there are some things, dissociative symptoms is one that's a little bit tricky, so if you have people that you're working with where they get, disconnected, that's why a lot of our classes focus on, just inviting them in for awareness, and with with our knowledge that it might be hard. It might be really hard for someone to do something like focus on their breathing. That might be really difficult. It might be hard for them to feel sensations. If you put out, like, you may or may not, feel a stretch somewhere or feel a sensation somewhere. It may be that they don't, because disassociation is present, and that it can take a long time to make an impact. The important thing to kind of keep in mind, without going into the nitty-gritty of data, is that there's a lot out there that shows this is helpful, and that's kind of the premise of the work that we do. Next slide. All right, and this is the Yoga for Change research, and I'm going to have Alex go over this because Alex has more knowledge with this.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too deep into it because there's a YouTube video that just came out with our actual research and data evaluation team that goes into the how and the why of the data. But I thought it was important to add this one because Yoga for Change is evidence-based, and that is a whole part of what we are doing in our work. Yes, we're offering these mental health tools to our populations, but we're also a part of this research that's happening. Like we are paving the path and changing the way that society sees yoga, mindfulness, and meditation. And I'll speak from a program director side when I'm speaking with organizations about getting programming, and Shiva and Victoria do the same thing. Is when we're talking to a lot of populations, the first thing that comes to mind for them is yoga, this woo-woo, hippy dippy spiritual practice. And so it naturally, because of the stigma around it, becomes a hard to sell program sometimes, especially when you're working with populations that might have a little bit more of a religious background, or might be a little heavier on specific faith-based practices. So the data that we're bringing in helps to bring numbers to it, helps to bring outcomes to it. It helps to show on paper that we know that yoga, mindfulness, and meditation is a healing practice for us and has helped us reduce our stress and improve our mood. And some of us maybe even heal chronic pain that we have from, our life traumas. But it's also helping in a numerical way, a quantitative way, what we call it. So this in particular, a lot of you are familiar with the Florida Blue program. And there are many of you on the call that are familiar with the Overdose to Action, the OD2A grant. This in particular is a year in review. So this is a little bit older, from October 2019 to September 2021. But this is something that we would show our facilities, and it shows the significant changes in the mood, stress, physical pain from those actual data cards that you're providing in the classes. Same thing with OD2A. I believe both of these grants work off of the Yoga for Recovery curriculum, which is that same curriculum that we did the meditation for in the beginning of class. So we at Yoga for Change are measuring not just mood, stress, physical pain, but also behind that, post-traumatic growth, emotional regulation, self-compassion, purpose. So these are all things that we're collecting and able to evaluate on to show the impact. And I know I've done it in South Florida, and I'm not sure if it's been done in the other regions, but whenever we pull reports on specific programming, whether it's, if you did it in Jax for Sophros, like I would send those data reports to the teachers so you actually can see your impact that you are providing to the actual students that you're teaching. So you can name drop me and I'll take the blame for it. But if you are interested and you do want to know, ask your program director, have them pull a report, or if there's been a report that's been pulled. We just did mid-year reports, so there are reports out there, and you can ask, hey, for my class, I would love to see the impact. Of course, it's not needed. Not everyone is into the numbers. But it is something that's out there. So I just thought it was important to add specific to Yoga for Change. Does anyone have questions on our data or anything that I've covered in this slide in particular? Awesome.
Something that I think is really helpful with this is that I am guilty of not being a very paperworky person. I'm just not really good with paperworky stuff. And so like sometimes I'm like, cards, surveys, pre-surveys, post-surveys, like all that stuff like is a struggle for me. And when I see the data and the information we get out of it, I'm like, oh, like that's important. It's important to know, like, that's how we measure if this is working. Like, what if it wasn't working? Like, we wouldn't want to keep doing something that wasn't working. We would want to adapt. So this helps keep me grounded in the why of why I'm doing things like entering data cards, which I hate. This makes it like worthwhile to do that stuff. I will also say, I presented our data at a social work conference a couple months ago in Orlando, I think back in June. And there were so many like social work people that came up to me that said, I came to this session specifically because I wanted to learn about this data. And they drilled me with questions, and they were like super, like, I don't know, impressed, amazed that we were getting like the results that we were getting with yoga. So things are shifting, I would say. Like, it's not even just in the time that Yoga for Change has been around. I think that there's been a lot of shifting towards more acceptance of some of these types of practices. All right, cool. We will keep going. And we are, like, I'm aiming for us to take a break at 11. That's why it might feel like I'm rushing a little, because we have kind of a where we want to get to before then. So we talked about the brain. So remember, again, hand model of the brain. So on this picture, amygdala and hippocampus are in the limbic system. That's your thumb area. Your thumb area is the limbic system. I find it helpful in remembering these things. So the amygdala is a tiny little almond shaped organ in your brain. I think of it as the screeching almond of fear. That is your amygdala, screeching almond of fear. It is just the smoke alarm that's always going off. Your hippocampus, also same area. Your hippocampus is in charge of memory. I remember, I don't have great memory because my hippocampus trauma, you know. The hippocampus I remember by thinking of a hippo on campus, a hippo going to school, a hippo on campus. So that's your memory organ in your brain. So what we know from all that mindfulness data we were just kind of referring to is that mindfulness practices are correlated with an increase in gray matter. The actual structure of the memory part of your brain, the hippocampus, is increased with mindfulness practices. We know that it decreases the gray matter in the amygdala. It means it makes your screeching almond of fear smaller, less sensitive. And we know that it activates the prefrontal cortex. That's the fingers that wrap around as we're doing brain push-ups. The part that regulates your limbic system is activated by mindfulness practices. So these three parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma are also positively impacted by mindfulness. And that is why, like, trauma-informed mindfulness and trauma-informed yoga is such a thing, because it targets the same things that are impacted by trauma. I hope that wasn't overly sciencey. Any questions? Okay, we're gonna skip this video because we did it ourselves, but I want you to know that it's there so that when you get this PowerPoint, you have it to refer back to. All right, so the neurons that fire together wire together. Basically, that's just like an easy to remember saying. The neurons are these little, on your screen, those like tendril-like things, those like little, the things that stick out. When they connect together, those little things connect together, the more often they connect together, it's like they bond. And so if it only happens once, there's not a whole lot of a bond there. If it happens repeatedly, like over and over and over again, these connect, it's kind of like, if you take a stick and make a line in the sand, if you just do it once, the sand kind of like falls in and it doesn't really stay a line. If you keep making that line in the sand over and over again, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then even if like the ocean comes up and it kind of like washes away, you can still see your line in the sand because it went over and over and over again, making that connection. So same thing happens in your brain. So a brain exposed to trauma, it's like, I'm not safe, I'm not safe, I'm not safe. That becomes a really strong connection. And so or like, I'm not in control is another one that happens to trauma. Like, I don't have control, I don't have choice. So what we're offering is repeatedly safety, connection, like connection to others, choice, autonomy. We're trying to provide opportunities for them to make these neural pathways that are stronger. We won't get into the networks of the brain. It's kind of helpful to know that the way that our brains function, whether we're resting or daydreaming or thinking and focused on a task, all of these different functions are improved with mindfulness practices in a nutshell. All right, next slide. All right, dysregulation in the window of tolerance. So we've kind of like talked around this a little bit, and now we're going to talk directly to it, which is that brain flipping experience. So when we are in the green area, our window of tolerance, we're regulated. We're not hypervigilant, like we're chill. We're not in survival mode. We're able to think clearly. We're in an optimal state. We're able to reason. We're engaged. We're able to connect with others. So the window of tolerance is not, we're not feeling threatened like we need to survive. If we encounter something that makes us feel threatened, we could go either direction. So we could go into hyper arousal, which is that fight, flight, freeze gets a little complicated, so we'll come back to that. But fight or flight is hyper arousal. So our body is like, oh no, something scary is happening. Remember David Burke-Harris, the bear is chasing us. We go into hyper arousal so that we can either run away from the bear, or we can fight the bear, hand-to-hand bear battle. That's why we're in hyper arousal. We could also go into hypo arousal, where the body is like, I'm never going to get away from this bear, so I'm going to shut down, like shut it all down, shut it down. We're going to just be dead, and maybe the bear will go away. And typically that happens because it is like a hierarchy where it's like, can you fight it? Yes, no. Okay, if you can't fight it, then run away. Can you run away? And if you can't fight, you can't run away, then the body just kind of shuts down and plays dead. It's important to know because this collapse response, so the hypo arousal would be like a total collapse, whereas hyper would be fight, flight, freeze. The tools that we use in a yoga class are going to be different for someone who is hyper or hypo aroused. Ideally, we would love if everybody in class all the time is in their window of tolerance, because then you can really work on skill development. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes people are hyper aroused or hypo aroused. So for hyper arousal, that's someone that's like has a lot of energy, they can't calm down. Things like mindfulness can help bring them down, grounding, and certain breath work. And the way that you're going to see hyper arousal is they're distressed. You might see tension in their bodies. Like when you go into warrior, you might see like a really firm warrior where you can see like muscles flexed, or their like fingertips are like flexed. Like you'll see like tension in their bodies. Whereas someone in hypo arousal, we give people the choice. So you may never see them get off the mat. They may be like on the mat, barely awake. Like sleeping doesn't really count. That's kind of a different thing, but like they're just, or if they do sit up, there's like it's just like, it's tough for them to hold up arms. Or they're just kind of checked out. Like you like see their eyes, they're just not present. And so collapse is different than freeze. And that's why it makes this really confusing. A freeze response would be if someone's kind of like in shock and they're not moving, but their heart is beating really fast. That would be someone in freeze. Fight, flight, freeze would be like their system is like wants to run away, but they're frozen. Whereas a hypoarousal, if they were totally collapsed, they wouldn't be breathing fast, their heart wouldn't be beating fast. It was really hard for us to tell on the outside whether someone's in freeze or collapse. It's much more challenging. You can look for breathing, whatnot. We don't need to diagnose whether somebody is necessarily in any of these things. We need to understand that if many of our students are hyper aroused, which is more common, that's just a more common place to be for someone who has trauma, we want to be careful to use breathing techniques that aren't going to bring them even further up. We want to bring them down. And that's why this is important to know. Because oftentimes people will use breathing that brings people the wrong direction. And breath is the most direct path to your nervous system, because breath is something that is both voluntary and involuntary. It's just a direct connection. So that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time on breath. And I think, do we go more into it in the next slide? Oh, how does it show? Okay, let's do this. So hyperarousal, when you see it, some of this is like really more evident with the kiddos. You'll see them literally like bouncing off walls. But even when I'm working in like recovery type places, sometimes it's just like jittery. It's hard for them to sit still. It's hard to not interrupt. That you might see that impulsive thing. Like we thought about like the flipping the lid, just like dysregulated is just like the word that always comes to mind. You can just see when someone is like jumping out of their skin, kind of dysregulated. That's what hyperarousal looks like. Fight, flight, freeze, dysregulated. Hypoarousal is just the opposite extreme. So a lot of these examples are going to be for youth, like sleeping in class. Self-harm is something that does also happen with hypoarousal, and it's just because they're so detached, they're seeking some kind of connection. Numbness. Sometimes in class, the way I see it show up is we'll talk about like, notice if and where you feel a sensation. So maybe we're doing the one where like your leg is on your ankle's on your leg and you're leaning forward. And some people in the class will say like, that's intense. I feel that. And then there might be one person who was like, I don't feel it. I don't feel this at all. And that's like a little clue like, and it might just be that little clue that you hear that you just have it in your brain. Like maybe, and you might notice it in conjunction with other things, that little disconnection. So that's what it might look like. And then how do we show up? So what do we do? Part of it is just to keep in mind that trauma is in our bodies. It's in our bodies, it's in our brains, and we can offer some connection. And some of this is a little tricky. So eye contact can be, for some, a positive social connection. It can be distressing for others. So just kind of be aware. Some of that can be cultural and some of that can be individual. Some of that can be neurodivergence. So keep in mind, if someone seems to be seeking eye contact, you can offer that eye contact. If someone is avoiding it, you don't want to cause more distress by like forcing it. Your presence, and I would say your authentic presence. So showing up as a full person to connect is powerful. Like that powerful, affirming them, making time to be there, like all of your connection there. Touch is not necessarily us touching students, but like it can be them, themselves. So something like this, where they're holding opposite arms and giving a squeeze, they're going to interpret that in their systems as, as a hug, as like an embrace. An ear massage can also do that. Like any kind of, these are things that we can incorporate in classes. An absolute unconditional positive regard. Like going into this with, these are humans. We are there to support these humans. And oftentimes, they are not getting a lot of positive regard in environments, especially when we think about incarcerated individuals or in Title I schools where there are kids that maybe have behavior stuff and they're sending them to yoga. Like there are a lot of the individuals and communities that we work with are not getting a lot of positive regard. So the more we offer, that allows that little brain connection again for them to like rewire and know that they're worthy and they're deserving, and there's compassion and all that good stuff. All right, next slide. All right, and this is going to be adding on another layer. So we talked about the window of tolerance, polyvagal theory, and this is ultra, you can go way deep with polyvagal. And if that is your jam, like absolutely go way deep with polyvagal. We're going to do it really, really briefly. Sympathetic is that fight, flight, freeze response. That's being hyper aroused. Yeah. So I would say for polyvagal theory, it's Deb Dana has a book, Polyvagal for something. The Deb Dana book, I think, is really good for polyvagal. There's also lots of podcasts out there and lots of stuff that you can start absorbing for free on polyvagal. And there's also like Deb Dana, Bessel van der Kolk, and a couple others do a free trauma conference, like I think twice a year, where it's like 4 days of like trauma stuff, and that is also really good. You can buy it and like watch it anytime, but it's super expensive, so I just attend the free one. Yeah, Stephen Porges is the other one that is in that. I will try to find the link to that site so we can share it all with you, because if you catch it when it's going on for free, it's cool, but if you have to pay for it, it's like $600 or something. Anyways, too much. All right, so yes, polyvagal. So when we're thinking of sympathetic, we talked about, that's that top of the window of tolerance area, hyper aroused. And then parasympathetic is two things. So parasympathetic can be either like socially engaged, rest and digest mode. That's that ventral vagal. So parasympathetic, like a lot of what we do is kind of bringing them into parasympathetic mode, because that's rest and digest is where we make social connection. It's kind of helps balance out hyperarousal. Too far into the parasympathetic, we go into the dorsal vagal, and that is the absolute shutdown. And that's what makes this tricky. I think like old school before polyvagal, it was like rest and digest good, fight or flight bad, and it was this oversimplified binary. And now we understand a little bit more that like too much parasympathetic brings us down into immobilization. And that's why things get a little bit tricky. I know that this is like throwing a lot of information at you. Any questions or clarification on this somewhat complicated piece of today's training? And all right. So Larissa, is this an excitement, or are you raising your hand?
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to work. Can it be both? It can be both.
Yes, it can be both excitement and a raising. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You can be both excited and confused all at once. So I just want to just take a moment to acknowledge this is a lot of information. And so if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm like maxing out, brain is full, you are not alone. It is true. That's why we like send the slides out afterwards, so you can go back and maybe like look at parts and absorb them. There's so much to polyvagal, it's hard to like cover in 5 minutes. And it's helpful to know. I think like if this is too much, go back again to the window of tolerance, and just that can be a little bit more accessible, where like if you're in the green zone, you're in your window, you know, you're not dysregulated. And if you're dysregulated, in general, it is much more common to be dysregulated and hyper aroused. Because if you look at this, it's like that's someone who doesn't feel safe. The I can't say the word, immobilization, that life threat, that happens when that's like a significant thing. That's a life threat. It's in your system as like a last effort. So it is not as common. So people, I think, sometimes think it's common because they get freeze and collapse confused, but the freeze response is part of hyper arousal. Does that make sense? Is that helping at all?
It does actually. I think not to. I'm trying to be careful and not to be attached to this personally, but I know for myself when I was very green and into my teaching and in just going through yoga training, all this thing was about taking it down and bring it down, just sit with yourself and think over it and breathe through it. And that left me so anxious that just, I was not moving, but it wasn't a great feeling, you know, it was more anxiety induced. And what I find, even especially for the recovery people that I don't want to say teach, but like I present in front of it, I said, just like shake, just wiggle it out, just get the wiggles off the mat before you start to, you know, visualize that space between your eyebrows and such, because that state of immobility can be rather daunting experience, I think.
Yeah.
Am I understanding that? Am I in the right?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say it's okay to apply this, not just okay, it is helpful to apply this to your own experiences, because it helps you have a frame of reference, like, oh, I know, yeah, I can relate to how that feels in my body. And it can be helpful to say, like, to pause, am I inside of my window of tolerance? Am I outside of my window of tolerance? Am I hyper aroused? It's going to be much harder to know that you're hypo aroused. And like I said, it is much less common. Fight, flight, freeze are all up here. And the window of tolerance, somebody asked, yeah, it was a couple slides ago. It was the one that had the green in the center. I don't remember the colors, maybe red or yellow up here and blue on the bottom. I've seen it colored differently. But basically, the reason it's important to understand is the next slide we're going to get into. Yeah, okay. So this is the window of tolerance slide that we talked about. And the reason that it's helpful is if you look at like what the arrows, like on how we like bring people in different directions. So like hyper arousal, it says use mindfulness, grounding, and breath work. And then the hypo arousal itself, it also says use mindfulness, breath work, and physical activity. So these sound very similar because they're just kind of very general, but the specific breath work is what we're going to get into, because the breath work is different for hyperarousal versus hypoarousal. And that's something to keep in mind. All right, so that's the window of tolerance. And we're going to go back to breathing practices. Okay. Oh, okay. I didn't even know I was muted. Okay, so there are some practices that are kind of good for all occasions. This is the last slide before we take a break. Yeah, I know. I was trying to get done before 11. I guess we can come back to it. We can do breath when we come back if your eyes are glazing over.
Let's pause here and then
yeah, that's fine.
This is a good starting point.
Okay, so we will pause and take our break, and then did we have a 15-minute break? I don't even remember the amount of time we did last time out.
Let's do 15.
Okay.
Let's come back at 23.
23. Okay.
I think my math is right. 11:23.
I trust your math.
And then I think we're solid from there.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Yeah, the rest of this goes a little bit easier and faster.
Yeah.
Less brainy.
So we'll pause, come back at 11:23, enjoy some food, some potty, all the things.
Awesome. Thank you. hypoarousal situation. Oh, I didn't see that note from Janice. You were, oh, I just love that. I love that you're here, and I love that you shared being part of, I don't know, yoga for change being part of your journey. Apparently this is where my talking is going to be problematic. So yes, much love, love that. All right, so getting into the breathing. So as I mentioned earlier, breath is directly connected to our nervous system. So there are a lot of other practices that affect our nervous system, but the breath is the direct link. Because of this, we need to just be very aware and very cautious with how we're using breathing practices, because it can really cause someone potentially to either regulate or dysregulate. And I'm personally very passionate about this because I am someone that has a PTSD diagnosis. I don't think I meet the diagnostic criteria anymore, to be honest. I don't have the symptoms that I used to have, which is awesome. It's very exciting. I can say only once did I have a true flashback, like a no longer in the room, back in the trauma experience. And the one time that it happened was in a yoga class, and it was because of a breathing exercise. And so that is why I'm super passionate about it. I think it was bellows breath, if I'm remembering correctly. And the reason that it did that is that I'm already someone who tends to be hyper aroused. You know, I'm hyper vigilant. I have anxiety, a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Like I'm always kind of like hover up here, like on the edge of my window of tolerance on the top side. And so this exercise, and that particular exercise, was a lot about quick inhales. And it was a high inhale to exhale ratio. And just in general, just so you know, to keep it in mind, your inhales are connected to the sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze. Inhales are fight, flight, freeze. And if you think about this just in a practical term, if you've ever been scared and gasped, like, that is because that's your body naturally preparing you to fight or run away. So inhales, fight, flight, freeze. Your exhales are connected to rest and digest, your parasympathetic. So the bringing you down. So if you think about this practically, if you've ever been in like a stressful situation and then finally felt like you can sit down, maybe you notice yourself sighing. Your body is sighing to take you out of fight or flight and into rest and digest. I have been sigh shamed much of my life. I am a sigher. You know, if I'm sitting there, my body sighs a lot. My body sighs a lot because I'm up here and it's trying to regulate me. So now that I know that, I used to try to like control it and feel embarrassed that I was always sighing, and people thought like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? I guess something was wrong. It was my nervous system was dysregulated. So I don't feel shame about it anymore. I'm like, oh, that's just my body trying to help me regulate. So that is information to keep in mind, because when we're using breathing practices, we want to be conscientious of whether we're trying to bring people up or bring them down. The other thing to keep in mind is that holding your breath is also sympathetic. And I've read articles where it says like it depends on if you're holding it on the top or in the bottom. In general, I've done like as much research as I can possibly do. What I have found is that holding your breath is sympathetic. If you think about that practically, that is also something you do when you're scared, right? Like, has anybody been like super like scared and you just like hold your breath and tense your muscles? It's a sympathetic response. And so those are the three things that are super important to remember. We probably should have like a separate slide that says this, but like inhale, fight, flight, sympathetic, exhale, parasympathetic, rest and digest, breath holding, also fight, flight, sympathetic. And that can guide you when you're using breathing exercises in your classes. So I would say the most neutral breathing practice, if you're just kind of not sure whether people are up here or here or here, is diaphragmatic breathing. So diaphragmatic breathing is one that tends to have a balanced inhale and exhale, although you can do it a little bit different. And because of where your vagal nerve runs in conjunction with like your abdomen, it can help tone your vagal nerve, which is just kind of universally a positive thing. So whether someone's here, here, or here, diaphragmatic breathing is a positive practice. With that being said, any breathing practice can potentially cause distress to people who have anxiety or just overactive sympathetic nervous systems, because just bringing awareness to their breathing, they might realize their breathing is short or like up here, and that might be distressing. So just always give an opt-out, like in any breathing practice or even any like practice where we're noticing our breath, give an opt-out. Like if it makes you uncomfortable to focus on your breathing, skip it. You don't need to, it's okay. And normalize it. It can be really helpful. All right, so we're going to practice some of these. So a diaphragmatic breath, it's also called belly breathing. If you know either one, there's probably a Sanskrit term that I don't know. I'm not like really up with my Sanskrit anymore since I've been teaching all these trauma-informed classes where we don't use it. I'm like, I've forgotten a lot of it. So diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing, whatever term you use, I'm going to try to back up a little bit, is breathing into your belly. If you're teaching a kids class, you can tell them to fill their belly up like a balloon. So we're going to just practice this for a moment. You can even, before you practice it, if you want to do awareness, you can place one hand, up here near your sternum and one hand on your belly and notice which one moves. So oftentimes someone that has a lot of sympathetic energy, it's their top hand that's moving. So that's just a helpful like awareness tool. To practice diaphragmatic breathing, we want our bottom hand, the belly hand, to move. So inhaling, filling your belly up with air. Exhaling slowly. Another full inhale, expanding your abdomen. Slow exhale. One more just like that, inhaling. And exhaling. So that's our diaphragmatic breathing. You can practice it any way that it suits you using your own authentic voice. So that one, safe for all the different levels of window of tolerance. Extended exhale is one I use often. I use often for myself in my own practices because I'm up here, and with the students in my classes, because oftentimes I see a lot of hyperarousal, a lot of up here. And it's not an extreme one where it will necessarily like shut somebody down. It tends to just bring hypoarousal down. It's not like an intense thing where it would cause someone to shut down. But if you have someone you're working with specifically that is already way down here, then it isn't probably the best practice for them. So just kind of keep in mind. So extended exhale can be super simple. It is like what we did at the beginning of this practice when I said, inhale, long sigh. A long sigh is an extended exhale. So it doesn't have to be this big formal practice. Sighing is extended exhale. You can also do counting and you can extend it slowly. So sometimes we do like a fingertip thing, especially with kids. So we might inhale 2, 3, 4, and then slowly exhale. So you could start with 4 and then exhale 5 and then 6, 7, 8, all the way until you get to like a 2-to-1 ratio of exhale to inhale. So those are to bring down, which is our most common stuff in the populations we work with. You can also bring people up. If you have, and I do see this with youth, Right now, I'm doing a school social work internship, and I'm at a school that starts at 6:50 a.m. A high school that starts at 6:50 a.m. I know this is bad for their brains. This is also their reality. So the kids I encounter are tired, and sometimes they're just like completely shut down. If I wanted to get them some energy, and if I knew them well enough to know that they're not kids that are prone to hyper arousal, I could use something like the breath of joy, which I'm going to do here. I can say I made the mistake once of using this with kids, and they were ping ponging off the wall. So do not do this with kids. If you already see you got some like ADHD going on, or they're already like way up here, no breath of joy. I made that mistake because I didn't understand breath, and I will never do it again. It was wild. So here is the breath of joy. If you would like to see it, I need to like stand up. If you want to practice it, you are welcome to practice it. If you know yourself and you are prone to dysregulation, do not feel like you need to practice it. But this is something to try if you want to see how it impacts you. So if you're going to try it, it requires standing. You can step away from your computer if you want to. And I will say, before you start, so take a moment before we do breath of joy, check in with yourself. Like, are you in your window of tolerance? Like, where are you at? Just like kind of, and your energy. So check in with your energy. Are you feeling lethargic? Are you feeling energetic? And then we're going to practice it. So a breath of joy is going to be 3 inhales. We're going to inhale up, inhale down, inhale up, and then a big exhale where we just kind of drop it down. You can even make noise. That's fine too. All right. So breath of joy. Inhale, 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 exhale. Inhale, 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 big exhale. Inhale, 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 exhale. All right, you can keep going. That's enough for me. I don't want to be totally dysregulated. All right, friends who practiced breath of joy, check in with yourselves again. How are you feeling? How's your energy? Whew. My heart is beating very fast. My body's like, why would you do that to us, Amanda? Why? You didn't need that. It is fun, and it can be fun for energy. Just use it with caution, and use it like if you think you need to bring them up, keeping in mind what too far up looks like. All right, the next one I'm going to talk about, I talk about because it is super common and annoying, and that is box breath, which is also strategic breathing. I think sometimes people call it square breath. It's what's too far up. Bouncing off the walls and being hyper aroused is too far up. We just want to be cautious about that window. We would like people to be within their window of tolerance. Yes, Alex.
Yeah, and I also want to add another, so there's the full blown, like when you really get into it. And then another way that I was taught that might not bring as much of that like up is to do different hand motions. So instead of full in, down, in, I also sometimes will teach out, out, up, and then down. So you're going in breath, in breath, in breath, down. So you can opt to go into the full, or you might switch it up with like a, and that's almost like if you've ever taken like a kids yoga training or done like bunny breath, like in a kids class, where you might do like 3 sips in and then the long sigh out. You can add the same options to it and still call it some type of breath of joy, because it's still bringing their energy up. With
it is bringing it up here. And so a lot of times when we learned these practices in like maybe regular teacher training, or just like taking yoga classes for a million years, like anything that's said to be an energy increaser is also going to increase your sympathetic nervous system. And that's why we have to be mindful, because if we're bringing people up that are already up, we're bringing them outside of their window of tolerance, and we're turning off their thinking brain. We're activating their limbic system. Like all of that stuff is happening. So we have to be very cautious with it. Okay, so box breath and strategic breathing. This is a very common one. And even with like my fellow like mental health / therapist workers, this is often ironically recommended for anxiety. It is not one that brings down your sympathetic nervous system. The reason that strategic breathing was developed, it is a military tool. And maybe, I don't know if Forrest used it in particular, but the reason they teach this in the military is because the goal is not to bring someone down. The goal is to expand their window of tolerance so that they are comfortable in fight, flight, freeze mode. It is still a fight, flight, freeze breath. Like that's what it's for, because we want people in the military to, they are in fight or flight. Like that's what they're doing. And we want them to be able to continue using their brains because it's important that they can both think and respond quickly. So the purpose of this breathing is to expand a window of tolerance. That's what makes it strategic breathing. Also, not everyone is ready for military training. It is military training. So it would be like saying to me, okay, put on this 75-pound pack and run 5 miles. I am not currently in physical condition to do that. So asking me to do something that would make me stronger, in theory, it would make me stronger when I'm not physically in a place, I got all kinds of stuff going on with my joints, I'm likely to get injured if I try to do that. So when we're using a breath like this, we don't want to do harm. And this is one that even though it's commonly recommended, there's a potential for doing harm. So some people may use this and say, this is so helpful to me because they were in a place where, you know, they were ready to expand their window of tolerance. If we introduce this to someone that doesn't have self-regulation skills, it could be harmful. We could cause them to be way up in that fight or flight and not know how to bring themselves back down. So that is why it's an important one to use with caution. And the reason and what the breath is it's an inhale for, hold your breath for, exhale for, hold your breath for. Like that's why it's called a box breath, is because it's 4 on all sides. So you would just be cautious with it. Yeah, Forrest.
No, yeah, everything you said is just right on point with the box breath. I even saw there was a guy called it, and it was some mindfulness group he was a part of, and I don't remember what it was, but they called it combat breath. Quite interesting. And if I do offer it, I offer it even like as a rectangle. So in the retention at the top and the bottom, I'll half it, and I'll offer that as half, and then I'll go into offering as the full box, but giving the option to just go into the rectangle if that's what their breath feels like. Because even folks that, you know, like us in the military, no, we don't want to go back to that experience. So you're absolutely right. I could trigger somebody to go back to something that, you know, hey, for like, you know, so.
Thank you. I think that rectangle idea is positive. And just like anything else, the choice to opt out is important, and normalizing opting out. Like our breath, the natural pattern of our breathing is more like an oval. We don't naturally, like if you're a natural breath holder, I'm a natural breath holder, it is likely because your nervous system is dysregulated. It is not what a regulated nervous system does naturally. So we want to be cautious. Does that make sense? Usually when I cover this, there is someone who loves box breath that wants to say how much they love box breath and how much it has helped them. I will make space. If anyone loves it and has helped you, it can widen your window of tolerance. And I'm just saying with our participants, be cautious. Does that make sense? I hope. All right. So that's my soapbox when it has to do with box breath, because it's the most common breathing exercise I see everywhere. And for people who are dysregulated, telling them to hold their breath is problematic. Cool. All right. That was breathing.
And I do want to acknowledge there's one question in the chat about when is the best time to do this? Is it before or after final rest? Just breathing, I would say in general, is what I'm getting from the question. Like, what would you recommend?
In our classes, I would say at the beginning, and this is the reason. If you're using any kind of breathing practice other than diaphragmatic breathing, there's a little bit of a risk of dysregulation, because like what I said, how it can bring them up or down. And I think that would be most responsible to do that at the beginning of class, because then you have the opportunity, if you see like, oh my gosh, now kids are jumping off the walls, you then have the opportunity to spend the rest of the class regulating them back down. Whereas if you were to do it at the end of class and then send them on their way, that could be tricky. There's a million breathing practices, and that's why I like focus on knowing is it taking like lots of inhales or sips of air. Those are going to be those risky to hyper arouse them. And those are the ones to really be the most cautious, and any that have to do with breath holding. And I think there is a little alternate nostril breathing. And I kind of love that story. Alex, will you just share that? It's another good example of what can be done unintentionally. Oh, you're muted, friend. Oh, okay.
I'm thinking, okay, so I've just, this
There you
is
go.
one of
Sorry.
those,
Go for it. I'll share after.
this is one of those points that I get a little confused on is, so for my normal classes, I'll do it to get everybody kind of grounded and centered. And I might do either humming bee breath or more diaphragmatic breathing at the end, or just deep breathing, just general deep breathing. But in these populations that we're guiding, I know we start with the meditation, which I love. I would use that in every class. But right before, because it includes a little bit of breathing, I think you take 2 or 3 breaths before you begin. But at the end of practice is what I'm wondering. So before Shabbat or before final rest, would you recommend doing the breathing exercises and then final rest, or doing final rest and then bring them out of that back to a couple of breathing exercises before you have the class break away?
That's a good question.
Final meditation and rest, that it's just the ones that bring them down. It does not make sense to bring anybody up and then expect them to be still. So if you're going to use something like diaphragmatic breathing or extended exhale, or any of the ones that are exhale focused that bring them down, I would still say before. And the reason is, again, you just don't want to be in a position where like you cause someone to be dysregulated and then sending them on their way. And there is technically, like, you could bring someone further down if they're already down. Like, you don't want them to have no energy either. So if they're in that rest, there's still an opportunity for them to check in afterwards and like maybe regulate themselves. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
I'd like to, and I'd like to remind people during the pranayama that week, those are practices they can take off their mat immediately. If they're feeling stressed or they get in a situation that's upsetting, just take a couple of deep breaths.
Yeah, and again, normalizing that is difficult for some people. So to say just take a couple of deep breaths,
I have got to drop that. Yes.
Yeah. So for like living in bodies that are dysregulated, like for me, just breathe is like one of those like activating things that makes me want to punch people. Like, just to be genuinely honest, like it does. And it's because I was a kid that like didn't understand, like, I'm breathing, I'm alive. Why do people keep telling me to breathe? It's just pissing me off. And I didn't realize I was a breath holder. I was a shallow breather. Like, I had all kinds of breathing stuff going on that nobody like taught me how to regulate. Or if eventually when they did, they told me things like box breathing, which just made it worse because it was about
Yeah.
holding the breath.
Yeah.
So just awareness, and we don't want to like belabor this, but just awareness that breath is powerful. So no matter what practices you use them with caution. Like just use them with caution. Like Forrest said, always offer an option to opt out. Always.
Yeah.
Always offer an option to opt out.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
also the verbiage in that too, which we'll get into a little bit more, but even just like just lift your arms over your head, just breathe.
Yes.
It's just the delivery of that verbiage in itself.
Yeah.
I'm still working on getting that out of my vocabulary.
It's tricky.
It's a
I
work
know. Programming. I do want to like quickly let Alex talk about the alternate nostril breathing thing, because I think it's a perfect example of how we can unknowingly.
Yeah. So when I was teaching actively in one of our recovery centers, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do alternate nostril breathing this week. I think this is going to be a really great one for this group. And so I went into it, and I had one student in particular that said, oh no, like this is not it for me. Like I was just brought back into like snorting cocaine. Her drug of choice was Coke. And so she said, I'm feeling like really uncomfortable and triggered right now because of this. And so we immediately stopped. And the first thing that I did was I had everyone stop, and I said, thank you so much for speaking up and speaking your truth and being vulnerable in this moment to let me know that. Now I know like where to go and where not to go with this breath. And then I took them into something else that was like a diaphragmatic breathing. So then, now that everyone has been brought into this like space because she said it out loud, everyone's now in this space of like, oh, like, does this make me feel uncomfortable now? I brought it back to her by thanking her, empowering her, allowing her to like not feel bad or feel shameful or guilty for saying that out loud. But then thanking her for letting me know and that awareness, apologizing, and then redirecting them into something that I knew was like, it was that like bringing them back down. So I just said, let's take 3 grounding breaths together, whatever that looks like for you. So then we took a big, like an inhale and then full exhale out. And we did that 3 times. And then I moved on. Like I didn't pay any more to it. I didn't want to bring any more awareness to it. And like sit on it forever, because however I show up in that is the way that everyone else is going to show up in that moment. So if I acknowledged it, we move on, then I was able to redirect the rest of the class and her, and she finished out the class. And so then I went up to her and spoke to her afterward, and again, apologized privately and, let her know. And Amanda, you can add on anything of maybe how you would have handled that if you were in that situation. But in that moment, I literally like knew nothing else to do but to empower her first, to thank her, and then bring it back to the actual class.
Yeah, because we're gonna mess up, y'all. We're humans.
Yeah.
We're gonna mess up, and that is absolutely inevitable. And so I think, thanking, if ever like you do something, activate someone, thank them. Absolutely, for letting you know. If it's activating, I think taking a couple grounding breaths makes so much sense, and then moving on. And if checking in is always a good, like if you notice something or if someone says something, holding the space afterwards for check-ins is helpful as well. So I think that's modeled ideally. Alex. Forrest, what do you have, my friend?
I'll try to hurry with this one, but I think it's very, very, very important because yes, alternate nostril breathing can be very, very triggering, obviously. And Alex, yes, you did handle that, very, very eloquently. What I want to say though is there is an option for it. Ashley, I believe I know she was with the training that I kind of was introduced to alternate body breathing. Because our nervous system will regulate, like you were saying, where you were holding and you're kind of deregulating. Our nervous system will automatically say, okay, I want more air to the left or the right or whatever to regulate our nervous system. So with the alternate body, you can do it even as a final rest, where you inhale starting at the bottom of one foot or the other up through that side of the body to the top of the head, and then exhale down the other side all the way to the bottom of the foot, and then back up through that foot and around and down through the body. Now, no matter how many times you do it back and forth, just please do it the same number of times through both. So if you do it one round, then do one round in through the entire body and then back down. Because then that way you are already creating that pathway for your nervous system to say, hey, this is what regulation looks like. And that's really a kind of our goal. Why do we have a practice, whatever it may be? It's so that we can bring that back to what is regulated instead of this. Yeah, I could go in for days about it.
I love that. Thank you for reminding me. I also, from Ashley, learned about the alternate body breathing. And I think that that's a helpful solution to avoid the potential for the triggering there. And it's really beneficial to connect the hemispheres of our brain. And we'll get this to this a tiny bit in the grounding practices. Thank you, Samantha. I'm glad you were here. All right, cool. So we're gonna go to grounding, which will include a little bit of that. So it can be as simple as sensing your feet on the floor, which we say is simple because that might be simple to say. Someone who is detached from their body may or may not be able to really connect with that feeling of feet on the floor. It can be, the weight of your hands where they're resting. It can be helpful. So if you're doing a mindfulness practice, I know a lot of anyone who's been through like mindfulness teacher training, a lot of it is like breath focused. It can be just on an anchor, and the anchor does not have to be your breath. The anchor can be, the feeling of your hands. It can be your feet on the floor. It can be visual. It can be something with your visual sense. It can be a sound. It can be a smell. It can be literally any of your senses can be used for a mindfulness practice. And you offer options, and so mindfulness with an anchor. And then when you're referring back to it, instead of coming back to your breath, you would say coming back to your anchor. So offering a lot of choice, which is again what we're going to get into with the trauma-informed care, a lot of empowerment, a lot of choice. Other grounding practices, the 5 senses. So I've heard this called like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you focus on 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, which includes like reaching out to touch something, especially if someone has a little bit of that disassociative stuff. 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 is kind of like a dealer's choice situation. 1 can be, you can taste the inside of your mouth, which grosses kids out. I would say do not taste your mouth with kids because they'll be like, "Bleh, it tastes gross," or whatever. I wouldn't do it with kids. 1 can be take a sip of water if everybody has water. That only works if everyone has water. 1 can also be an affirmation. So you can bring in an affirmation. And if you're teaching to one of the curriculums where there's like a theme that you're focused on, you can bring that in for that number 1. It could be something as like, why is my mind blanking? I am worthy. It could be I am grateful. It could be, I have courage, like whatever. It could be anything, any kind of affirmation if you want to for number 1. All right, that's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Butterfly hugs. I love butterfly hugs. And it doesn't have to be just kids, but maybe you don't call them butterfly hugs with adults, but a butterfly hug is where you cross thumb over thumb. And then you bring it up here. So my thumbs are kind of resting on my sternum, and then you alternate. These are butterfly hugs. And this makes me instantly sigh, and that's my body regulating. And so what this is doing is it's a form of bilateral stimulation. And that's also very similar to what Forrest was talking about, that alternate body breathing. It's connecting the two hemispheres, and that does help us regulate. So that's a benefit. A self hug. So I often use, like, if we're twisting, sometimes I'll have them bring their other arm around and then bring them up here. So, and I offer two. I offer hold on to opposite arms or opposite shoulders. Even though it's super comfortable for me to hold on to opposite shoulders, it is not comfortable in all bodies. So I offer lots of options there. That you can incorporate. If you're someone that's familiar with tapping, you can incorporate like tapping, which can be done as part of like EFT, or like sometimes we tap along our neck and it feels nice and also releases like neck tension. So that's another grounding. And rocking. So rocking our nervous system. If you think about like babies crying, like we instinctually know to rock crying babies, there are actually two things going on. One is we are bringing the baby's nervous system in rest and digest. Also, the caregiver, the person caring for that baby, it is bringing their system into rest and digest. And so there's additional benefit because there's co-regulation going on. Now, it's a lot of sciencey stuff, but basically our bodies naturally regulate with rocking. So rocking in a yoga class could be incorporated, like it could be like this. If I'm doing this, I also offer the option to keep the leg on the ground and rock. Sometimes, rock the baby, but I normalize all the choices. I don't just do one at a time. I'm like, choose one, whatever works for you. Again, we're trying to empower. All right, that's some grounding stuff. Feel free, if you have other favorite grounding things, to put them in the chat. Sharing wisdom is awesome. I also want to be mindful of time. Okay, so trauma-informed care. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of how do we apply knowledge, which we've started to do a little bit already. These principles are what apply to all the things. Just like we mentioned earlier, any kind of organization can be trauma-informed. The focuses of trauma-informed principles are safety, which is both physical and emotional, trustworthiness, so that authenticity is huge, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, which this is kind of more specific to SAMHSA, but peer support doesn't have to be like a peer support specialist. It can be saying like samesies, like I feel you. Like that is a form of peer support, just like connecting and relating. Yeah, using your lived experience. And then just being aware of, different vulnerabilities from a historical, gender, cultural perspective. All right, what this looks like in application on the next slide. So when we're looking at these, the main premise, and we mentioned this earlier, is instead of asking what's wrong with this person, what's wrong with this kid, shifting to what has happened. So just generally looking at the world instead of, what's making that is like the assumption that something has happened and that is causing the behaviors that you're seeing. So when we're thinking about the principles that we covered, like creating safety, so that physical safety and emotional safety, we're going to start thinking about what these look like in your classes, because we're going to ask for everybody to kind of participate and be involved in a moment. So we're creating physical and emotional safety. We're offering tons of choices, like always choice, always control. We're collaborating. So I am always telling my classes, like, this is not my class, this is your class. Like, thank you for inviting me in to share some ideas. It's your class. And I will check in periodically, like, do we feel like standing up today? Do we want to stay on the mat? Like, what are we feeling? So collaborating, so they're really taking ownership, like what next? Building trust, which includes maintaining boundaries. So when we were getting into that vicarious trauma stuff, boundaries are an important part of building trust. So we don't want to just open people up and open up sharing of traumas because the reality is we can't close them up again. So that's not a good way to build trust, because then we're going to be in these situations like, oh no, what do I do now? And they're like, oh, they don't want to hear anymore. So establishing kind of the boundaries, and so part of that is you, like if you say something like, okay, I have anxiety, depression, I've been impacted by trauma, but you don't share your own details. Like you wouldn't say, I'm a survivor of sexual assault or something, because once you share that, then that gives a cue to others like, oh, we're sharing that. That's what we're doing. So just being cautious with setting the tone for what goes on in the class. Empowerment, like tons of, validation, and like really we're giving them skills. Like we're sharing knowledge. And that's like, if we're sharing the brain, we're empowering them with knowledge. If we're sharing grounding practices or breathing practices or like the asana, all the things, like we are sharing them in hopes that they continue them forward. It's not about us, it's about the things that they can use helpfully. And then cultural humility, and just kind of being aware, it can get tricky, and just like I'm a white lady, I often teach classes to men, which is like not ideal, but it happens. I teach classes where there are like, I am the white person in the room and all of my participants are people of color. And so going into it with the awareness, like we are who we are. We are who we are, and that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with being who we are, and not having like kind of ethnocentricity where I assume my perspective is their perspective, like following their cues. I live in East Boynton Beach, Florida. It is a predominantly Haitian Creole community. So I have taught classes where half of my participants were Creole speaking only, and it was like we just kind of taught without words. They're sensitive to things that feel religious. So I am mindful, even if it's not yoga for change stuff, I'm mindful about the yoga practices to not feel like it's some foreign religion that it's going to cause them discomfort. I might emphasize something like practices of yoga come from India and Africa, because for one thing, that's true. They come from India and Africa. And I think it's helpful to like empower and help people to know that. So just having humility, not making assumptions, and being really open-minded and learning from others are all super helpful tools there. On the next slide, we would like to hear from you. So there at the top of your screen, and if you have an iPad and you're not sure where it is, don't stress out about it. But for this, where I know it to be is at the top of the screen, there's a view options button. And if you scroll down towards the bottom, there's a little thing that says annotate. And then you can click on a place on the screen and use the text. There's like a little thing that says text, and you can write something. Yeah, yes. So we would like to hear from you. Like, what are the things that you do in your yoga classes that fit into these categories? And we won't see it, I think, until you hit enter or click out of it or something. So if you're typing and you're like, where's my thing? After you actually type it, it will show up. So I find the text easier. I mean, if you're super skilled and want to like write it handwritten, like cool. And if you're like, I cannot find annotate, you can shout them out and I will annotate. So feel free to unmute. And I don't know. I wish I knew how to do this on an iPad. I don't. Unmute and I will type them in for you so they appear. That's cool too.
Yeah, you can also write it in the chat because I see some squigglies. So like some people want to talk. So if you want to type it in the chat, I can type it for you in the list of like whatever bucket you want to put it on.
It's an opportunity to be a little bit more interactive. It might be a little bit clunky. It's an experiment.
And Ashley, where would you like me to put and I invite my students to close their eyes, the creating safety?
Creating safety or offering choice.
Offering choice, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
So I can't even see your screen. I can only see the tabs of the people. So I don't really know what we're supposed to be writing.
Oh, you can't see
Oh.
like the,
No. It hasn't let me in the whole time. So I can see you, I can see Forrest, I can see whoever is Yoga for Change and, you know.
oh, so
but
you
that's
haven't been
it.
able to see the slideshow?
No,
Hmm.
Oh, that's not cool.
Are you on an iPad?
I'm on my laptop, which is an Apple product, but it doesn't, there's no annotate at the top. All I have is the ability to mute or take the video down.
Can you go to the upper right-hand corner? Does it have view and then go side by side with speaker?
No,
You don't have that? Okay.
no, all it is a tab and you guys are about, it's a thumbprint tab. And I have options to just see the speaker or see everyone who's in the room and that's it. It's like a tiny little thing. There are 3 dots, but my options are mute my auto, stop video, blur my background. Sorry.
Is anyone else having this problem? I'm stumped on why that's happening, but I
Yeah.
will make sure you're gonna get the slides, you're gonna get everything, so you'll be able to see what's
Okay.
happening here.
Okay, yeah, I've had my video and audio muted because I'm chasing around a
No
1-year-old.
worries.
That's okay.
Thank you for staying on.
Yeah, no, I want to be able to participate. I do have some fun things to share, just working with kids and working with people in overdose recovery. I get a lot of people crying and during my classes as, you know, things arise and come to the surface. And
Yeah.
like the kids are always like, oh, so-and-so's crying. And I was like, this is her healing journey and we're just going to keep moving forward and let her do what she needs to do. If she wants our help, she's going to ask for it. And so she just keeps crying. We try not to let it be an extension, you know, and at the end of class, I always check in and say, are you feeling better? Was that helpful? And they're usually like, yes. Is there anything else you need? Sometimes it's a hug, you know, something like that. So it is, things are always happening in class. Things
Yeah.
come up, people cry, they're triggered, they're all kinds of things, but usually there's an option to share. So I'm going to shut down because it's about to get crazy in my house with teenagers re-arriving. So go back. Thanks
No
for all the
problem.
stuff you're doing. Okay.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
A question in the chat from Cindy. I would say hands to heart. Is that, yeah. Palms together, your heart center. Yeah, either one. Whatever feels more authentic in your voice.
And I also want to I want to speak to that because this happened in actually, I'm gonna put Elena on the spot if you don't want to, but this reminded me of when you were onboarding. Would you be open to sharing that heart center example that I'm thinking of? Do you remember that?
Yeah, it wasn't about bringing your
It wasn't
hands to your heart,
but it was the same.
Yeah, so when I was onboarding, I don't remember who, somebody had said to me, don't use the word chest when you're cueing a posture. So when I wanted to say, and again, I'm coming from teaching hot yoga, when I wanted to say lift your chest, I was saying lift your heart. And I probably said it a lot because in a lot of postures you're lifting. And one of the students in my class said, what does that mean? She stopped me like after I said it a few times. She said, I don't understand what that means, lift your heart.
Yeah, I was grilled and it was pounded into me by Catherine Thomas not to say heart, not to say prayer, hands in front of the chest. And she's very effective. Everything she stuck in my head just stuck there.
Yeah.
And I do want to also add to like Elena, and I had Elena answer her in that moment because I thought it was a really just beautiful exchange that the student even felt that she could ask that. And Elena's response was great. And she basically like had her move through it physically. So imagine you're lifting upright and your shoulders kind of hug back. And so immediately what happens when you lift up, and the woman said, oh, my heart starts to like, my actual physical heart starts to lift up. And she said, exactly. So think of it as the motion of extending upward into more of an upright posture. So like they broke it down. But that is where our mind goes as yoga instructors, because we know what lift your heart up. No one else in your class, chances are going to know what that means. So it's breaking it down, breaking down your verbiage, peeling back the layers so that it's even more technical. Like what Anne said, bring your hands together in front of your body, or bring your hands together in front of your collarbone. That's one thing that I don't know if we do it in here. It would probably be in like building trust. But when talking about certain body parts, like trying to stay away from, chest, or speaking to the hip. So using other body parts that we've learned in anatomy, like your collarbone. You hear Amanda and me say collarbone quite a bit, or clavicle, because that's an actual area right by your heart.
Nice.
Sorry, I just got a notification that I was signed out. So, but I hope I'm still here.
Still here.
Okay, cool. So within that, it's just knowing the awareness that, we, in our minds, like we have a certain way, but that they don't. So I thought that was, just speaking to the prayer hands, or hands to heart center, just having that awareness that they may not know what that means.
Right.
Lately,
Yeah.
I've been using, and it seems to work, I have them find their sternum and then press their sternum into your thumbs, which opens you up and pulls your shoulder blades back. I've been doing sternum a lot lately.
Yeah, I think sternum works, and bringing your hands together and modeling it. I think just another little thing to keep in mind is that trauma can affect, very commonly affects like audio processing. And so I know like some of us, if we went through yoga teacher training, where like it was like, oh, you're not practicing, you're just speaking. Oftentimes the different people that we're working with need to see things modeled, and just relying on words alone isn't going to work. And if you go back to that thought of the prefrontal cortex, that is a big part of all of this. Like it's they're in their bodies trying to reconnect with brain and thinking mode. So in these types of classes, it can be really, really helpful to think that, there might be more visual cues needed for our students than there might be in like some studio classes. Does that make sense?
I would agree wholeheartedly. I find that in traditional like yoga studios as well.
Mhm.
People need modeling.
Yeah.
They can't just do words. For mine, I just model it. I'm like, let's bring our hands together. And then I bring my hands together, and then they do the same thing. I don't say heart center. I don't say prayer hands. I just say, let's bring our hands together. Maybe connect to our heart, something like that.
Yeah, it can be super. I find it really tricky because I teach a good amount of chair mat classes where I'm physically going back and forth between a mat and a chair. And like I have half the classes doing mat and half the classes doing chair. And as much as I may say, you can stay standing, I'm going to demonstrate from the chair. Oftentimes I will see participants going back and forth from chair and mat. And it is what it is. And I just like, nobody makes a big deal about it. Let it go. It's fine. It's cool if they're doing a half and half practice. It's a little bit more exercise, I will say. But we don't have to stress too much about it. They're still getting some good stuff out of it. All right. These are super good suggestions in here. So thank you for collaborating on what this actually looks like in practice. And often it might be hard to put things in a category because they actually apply to multiple things. So when we're telling people that they have the option to practice with eyes open or eyes closed, that's a lot of things. That is building trust, giving, because they're like, okay, like I don't feel comfortable closing my eyes, but then later maybe they do feel comfortable. Like it's building trust. It's offering choice. It's creating safety. If they need to keep their eyes open for safety, that's a huge thing. And it's empowering them to make these decisions. So some of the practices, one little thing can fit into like nearly all the categories. Coolio.
So
All right.
I've taken a snapshot of this so we can have it on when you get your slides as well. I'm going to clear that.
Coolio.
And then we will, let me exit out of here and move on.
Awesome. All right. So, and this is kind of just more of a brief discussion piece. So how is it? Like, how is it understanding these trauma-informed principles, understanding what's happening in the brain and nervous system with people impacted by trauma? Like, how can this understanding better inform our practices? And this is just opening up, like, as you're sitting here, like, how are you thinking right now that this might impact your classes? And you can use the chat or unmute. Either way is cool.
Just being aware and knowing things that are more likely to trigger somebody, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's like one big component is we want to not cause harm.
I
'Cause we
think
won't- yeah.
tone of voice and your own energetic presence has a lot. So like, obviously, as a yoga instructor, sometimes we'll accidentally slip up and say pose. And yes, that could be a triggering word, but when we're saying it and like kind of covering it and really coming into the classes, I'm here for you. I'm here to support you. This is a safe space. Like, I love you guys. There's a lot more give, and it's less triggering when it's coming with this delivery of, I'm here to help. I'm here to offer. I'm here to serve you and to teach you tools that may be beneficial to you. So I think there's a lot of, yes, things can be triggering and there's so much that's out of our control, but at the same time, the delivery, our tone, like the eye contact, and that felt safety, we have a lot of the way we show up in class really kind of creates that environment for them. So even if our class introduces something that could be triggering, like the alternate breathing and the cocaine use, things like that, obviously out of our control. The way you handled it was to acknowledge and change, and all that's all we can do.
Yeah, we're showing up authentically as full humans. Like, we're not there as robots, although sometimes we're showing up virtually. Even when we show up virtually, we're showing up with our full human selves and connecting and being very intentional about that connection. So absolutely, like, thank you for sharing that, Christian. Like, we're there, we get to witness like some amazing journeys. Like, that's awesome. We are there to support along their way. We are there to like respect their wisdom and like empower that. And there's just a lot to be done from that perspective. Forrest, what have you got, my friend?
Thank you. So yeah, everybody, I mean, nobody, I think he has the intention of triggering anybody. So, and I try to take it a little bit further, like, okay, because that's not my intention, but what would be my impacts? And that's what really everybody is saying here. What are my intentions are this, but what impacts? And we're going to get that by understanding our students better.
Yeah.
So me, how do I understand what does understanding my students better do for me? It helps me understand what my impacts and my intentions are.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you, friends. All right, we're gonna move on to the next bit. I'm being very mindful of time. All right, so a lot of times when especially when I would say onboarding new teachers, which is something I do consistently, a lot of times coming into this, if they're not coming from a trauma-informed background, they're looking for like a list. Like, what are What are the postures I avoid? What are the words I avoid? What are the postures I avoid? Like, give me the list of things to avoid. And my response is that it is not that simple. Like it really is not. So coming from a trauma-informed perspective, it's more of the how and than the what. It is more of like keeping those principles in mind, and how you are going to apply them is going to change. It's going to change with different populations. It's going to change every day, different classes. It's in constant flux. So it is not this simple black and white, do this, don't do this. It is putting on your trauma-informed lens and approaching, every class with that lens. Like, how am I supporting in this moment? How am I empowering? How am I giving choice? How am I creating physical and emotional safety? Like how do I apply this? And so it would be maybe easy if there were just a list. It is not that simple, my friends. It is very complex and very much situational. Some things that we know are helpful, offering some anticipatory guidance. So you notice when like I did the breath of joy, I told you what we were going to do, and then I did it. Like I gave you like a little heads up. We're going to do this and then this. That can help like ease some anxiety. Like, okay, and then if I am coming into especially like a new class or something, like we're going to do this and this, like we're going to practice a little bit of meditation. We're going to move our bodies a little bit, and then we're going to rest, and then we're going to check in again. Like offering like, this is what this is going to look like, is part of creating some trust and safety, and like also normalizing things. Like if you're going to get pulled out of class, cool. Like a lot of times in the recovery classes, people get pulled out, and we don't want them to be stressed out about it. So normalizing all of that. If you can come back, awesome. If you're not going to come back, like if you have time to like check on your card first, cool. Like, but just normalizing like what they can kind of expect. And that also helps other people in the class know like, oh, like somebody left mid-class. Should I be worried about this? Like if we're upfront and offering some guidance, it reduces anxiety. We've talked a lot about options, choices, invitation. I will say approaching things non-hierarchically. So that's a hard word to say. Approaching things so there's no like, if you can't do this, do this. Like there's no better or worse. There's no like levels. It's all just choices. Use whatever option best suits you today. Choose your own adventure. Yeah, we don't say if this is too hard, if your body doesn't do this, like eliminating all of that language, like if you can't do this, like, because that's not what it's about. And our goal is that empowerment piece and that choice. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, that's what guides us. We're guided by our goals to empower and offer a lot of collaboration and options. Optimal for your body. If that is what's authentic in your voice. I don't think I've ever used the word optimal, and it wouldn't sound authentic coming from me, but I say like, choose your own adventure, like, or like whatever works for you today, because what works, it's not always the same. Like, try it out, see what feels supportive. Anything that's just encouraging them to check in with themselves and then appropriately choosing. And honestly, my classes, I think if someone came in from the outside without any kind of trauma-informed perspective, it would look like chaos. Everybody's expression of what they're doing looks totally different. And that brings me lots of joy, because I'm like, oh, they're like choosing what they want to do. They're like empowered. This is cool. Someone from the outside is like, what is this? Like, what are we doing? This is pigeon. I don't understand. So that's kind of what we're using to guide us. And these are all came from a chapter of a book that's specifically about trauma-informed yoga. And now I think it's Resources for Teaching Mindfulness, Chapter 18, Teaching Individuals with Traumatic Stress, by Trish Magvari. When you get the PowerPoint, it's in the notes. So if you want to explore more on this, it goes into a little bit more detail on what we can actually do. So we are going to practice some of these principles. And we initially had planned, we are like a little bit behind on time. So we're gonna have a super short practice, but we are gonna do a practice.
Or we can go through and come back to it if you want. I don't know if that would
in
make
the
more
practice.
sense.
Okay, maybe we'll do that.
Totally up to
We'll do
you.
that. So remember all these things in your brain. We're gonna come back to it because we want to be really mindful of people's time, and we
Yeah.
don't want to we don't want to keep you here long.
And
So
I
we're
want to acknowledge in the chat really quick.
gonna come back. Oh,
Yeah, I want to acknowledge something in the chat really quick, just on that topic before we move on. Someone had mentioned offering or like saying, yeah, starting with one option and then yes, working up from there. Absolutely doing that. And not speaking to like it being the easiest option, but maybe offering it as, I think I've heard you say, Amanda, like bus stops, like bus stop number 1, bus stop number 2, or someone else does that.
No bus stops. Actually,
Okay.
no. So
Okay.
easiest, no. Working up to, no. Bus stops, no. And this is the reason. And it's going to take some rewiring of the brain, which is okay because our brains are plastic. In a trauma-informed approach, you don't want any hierarchy. So anything with numbers or levels or directions is still hierarchy. And the reason is because we don't want their goals to be like what it looks like and like feeling like some kind of pressure to get to a certain point, or feeling shame, like, oh, I'm only at bus stop 1 and they're at bus stop 3. Like, we want to just kind of eliminate all of that stuff. And I know this is hard. And I know that this is not maybe what we're taught in yoga teacher training. We are taught like modifications and hierarchy. We're taught that a certain expression is like the goal. So we have to erase all of that and truly come back to a trauma-informed perspective of choice and empowerment and safety. And if you're coming from that perspective, there is no whether it's easy or hard. It's just individuals checking in with their own bodies and choosing what their body needs in that moment. So it is not an external thing where they're trying to achieve something. It is an internal connection to their experience. And I hope that makes sense. And I know that this is hard to unlearn. I know
it does absolutely make sense. And I've been practicing that with an aqua yoga class that I sub in my regular yoga classes. So it's not that I use the word easiest, but I start with, like, for lack of a better term, lowest common denominator. So you start in tabletop. So if we're going to go to spinal balance, it's, if you want to put your right foot behind you, and then if you feel like you want to raise your left arm in front of you. So it's building it that way without using the words. So you're saying drop the word option as well?
You can use the word option. You just don't want to make it, the reason that I wouldn't always do it in that structure is because they're going to pick up on these cues of, oh, the last one is always what I should be striving for. And we're kind of trying to eliminate that, because the goal is like a body reconnection where it is not an external goal. It is checking in internally, like what feels the best. And even like what I model, like I love to rock the baby. This feels great in my hips. This is a great stretch for me. Sometimes I will do this. Sometimes I will do this. Sometimes I will keep my feet on the floor. I will mix it up, even in my own body. So I will go through all of the options in various orders, not consistent. And people often, if they've been practicing for a while, they know their favorite and they will go to their favorite. And that's why I say my classes, everybody is doing different stuff. Like they're just all over the place because they've learned like, oh, this is what I like. And so that's why we don't start with easiest and get hardest necessarily. I mean, it's okay that to build off of something, but as long as you're really mindful, like if you're going to do it that and start easiest, get hardest, don't model the hardest. Like don't stay there. Offer it as an option and then bring it back.
Okay.
So I don't know if that helps.
It does. Yes, it's a lot, but yes,
It is a lot. I know.
I'll practice it with my non-trauma classes first.
Yeah. I have found once you're like in this mindset where you have the lenses on, they very likely will not come off eventually. And so all of your classes just naturally become trauma informed just because you become a trauma informed teacher, and it is just the methodology that becomes most natural. So go easy on yourself. If you can just remember something, remember that the goal is for it to not have a hierarchy, like not a hierarchy. We're not doing option 1, 2, 3. We're doing 3 different options.
Okay.
Just 3 different options. They feel really different.
The way I approach that in my classes is I model each option, but I say some days when I'm doing yoga, this option feels best in my body. I let them know that they can try and be curious and explore all 3 options, and then they're going to find some days one works best and some days others. So that gives them an opportunity to know that the options exist for them, and that just because one doesn't feel good, they shouldn't avoid it always. They just might want to avoid it today and then maybe try a different day, knowing that we feel different every day.
Yeah. And if you've been working with a class for a while where you do see that they're choosing the same things, even like normalizing, like, hey, if you normally do this, maybe try this today, like just as options. So like if I'm doing like this, bringing my hands together and on a side bend, I offer this option. I offer holding the wrist. I offer bringing the hand down. And I might say, if you're someone that always holds your wrist, maybe try something different today. Maybe try hands together. Maybe try bringing your hand down. Just like encourage. And if you don't like it, skip it and go back to the one you like. But, just to encourage like trying things, because that's a little bit of an extra little benefit of not, getting stuck in a rut, and encouraging growth mindset and blah, blah, blah.
Okay. Thank you.
Somebody had their hand up and I totally missed who it was. And
I think it was Larissa.
It was Larissa. Larissa, did you have a question?
Just a quick one, and now I'm gonna now I'm scared to ask. So the question I had is, what's if something that I say at times is I go, well, let's try on this pose like you would try on a piece of clothing and see if it fits. So for example, for like runner's lunge, so we'll try this on, and if it doesn't fit, let's bring our knee down. Your thoughts, maybe? Yes, no?
Yeah, I think, like I said, when you show up authentically with your voice, like your authentic voice is what people are connecting with. So it would feel weird in my voice because it's just not my voice. So just playing with the wording until you're authentically you is a big part of this. And I think that's what Christian spoke to a little bit as well. Like when you're showing up as yourself, I think that that's helpful. And sometimes that just takes time. Like it just takes time to find your like yoga teacher voice or whatever. Like sometimes it just takes a little bit to find the words that feel like authentically you. But yeah, if you're using it, as long as it's not like coming back to non-hierarchical, like that's an important piece. And it's more, again, about the how than the what. I hope.
Right. And that's what I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I would even go a little bit further than, just a little bit, starting with a more advanced option, go, okay, well, this doesn't fit. Let's take it down. Not take it down, but let's try it on for size.
Yeah, cool. I think that, as long as it's not hierarchical, I think that sounds totally doable.
Yeah, thank you.
You do the thing that works.
Right. I just want to make sure because I'm, like I said, pretty green to this.
Yeah, no. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. I think Alex will skip the practices and do the other stuff and come back to the practices. Cool, thank you. So these are in the slide, and I'm including them as resources because oftentimes we focus on the positive. It is very positive. Like, yes, we're all here probably because we've personally experienced something positive with the yoga and mindfulness practices. And people can have adverse effects. So that's what these resources are about. And you will get these. Just awareness of, like what happened to me. I absolutely had a flashback triggered in a yoga class. And that wasn't, it was just a thing that happened. We don't want people to think there's something wrong with them. So just knowing about these resources will help you, because some of them are specific for like teachers, to have language. If someone comes up to you after class and says something like that, like if it was me and I'm like, that totally triggered a flashback, it helps to have some resources to know how to respond. I would say even without looking at these, normalizing, validating, like those are things that connect us. So when you, and help the person to not feel like alone or weird or whatever. So anything you can do that like says like, yes, that can happen in a yoga class. Thank you for sharing that. Again, kind of like what Alex did, like thank them for letting you know and for sharing and being vulnerable and normalizing that, these things can happen. That's all the important stuff. The podcast I do find like, helpful if you're someone that has to do a lot of driving and like uses driving time to learn things. It can be a good learning podcast. All right. Okay, this one is more like an optional homework assignment, but we wanted to include it in here. So this survey is specifically for helping professionals. It's called the Professional Quality of Life Scale. And it deals with a couple different categories. One is compassion fatigue. One is compassion satisfaction. And then secondary traumatic stress. So those are measured a little bit differently. It's helpful to be aware of it so that you know if you have like a higher risk factor. So some of these, you can find this work super rewarding. If you find it super rewarding, like you love what you do, you will probably have a high compassion satisfaction. Like you feel like you're making a difference. You can have high satisfaction and have a high risk factor for something like secondary traumatic stress, because if you're someone that like, oh, like that trauma dump impacted me for months afterwards, like that's going to be a higher traumatic stress factor. Compassion fatigue, that's more like going towards burnout. Like you're just like, don't feel like you're making like the same kind of impact anymore. It feels like nothing matters. You find yourself not having patience for the people that you're working with, or not having the same level of empathy for the participants. So that's kind of what that deals with. So that code brings you to take the test. It's like a weird one to score. So we're not going to take the time to do it because it takes a while.
I was going to say, can you explain how the scoring, so if they do want to do it on their own? I know but I think that's important because also there's going to be people watching the recording.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
So
for sure. So there are directions to score it. So basically, like, you look at the different categories relate to specific questions. So it's not like questions 1 through 10 are this, and it's more complicated than that. So basically you follow the directions for which questions relate to which category: compassion satisfaction, burnout, secondary traumatic stress. And then a few of the questions, they flop them. And that's just because they're trying to like make sure that you're not just, scoring 5s on everything. So they flop them. So if you follow the scoring instructions and just give yourself time to focus on it, then that will give you the appropriate categories. Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
So like the scoring where you say like it says go to 1, 4, 15, 17, and 19, reverse your score.
Yeah. So those numbers, yeah. So they flop them.
Right. Same thing with the others that you see for those. So that's where it becomes super important if you decide to do this. And then for those that are watching the recording that have to do this as a part of their makeup assignment, this part of it will be just as important as actually taking the test. So
Make sure your prefrontal cortex is online. This is a thinking brain assignment.
yes.
So yeah, you just have to, even if you might have to read the directions a couple times, like, what is this? I have found it's not very helpful to do it if you're rushed. So that's why we're not doing it as part of this training. Right. Homework assignment.
Yes.
Cool. All right. What else we got? So we have talked a lot about trauma. We also want to come back to resilience. And I mentioned this earlier. Yes, there is epigenetic trauma we pass on. We can also pass on epigenetic resilience, which is super cool. So things that are involved as protective factors have to do with having a support system and positive relationships. Some of these are kind of like intrinsic traits where like sometimes people naturally have a more positive attitude and they're just naturally adaptable. And some of this we can actually control and change. So I think it's important to be aware of resilience factors. Like some of them are within our scope of impact. Some of them might be biological and less within our scope of impact. And at the same time, the work that we do to build our own resilience, like it can carry on. So there's a link here to building resilience skills. One cool thing is in the research they found when they were doing like the ACEs surveys and all that kind of stuff, is that having just one supportive adult in a child's life doesn't have to be their caregiver, just one supportive adult, teacher, coach, maybe yoga teacher, one supportive adult can significantly reduce the impacts of having a high ACE score. So that is huge for the work that we do, especially if you're, with some of these groups we're with long-term, some of it's a little bit shorter term, but we can be that consistent, supportive adult. We can positively impact their entire future. So that's something to keep in mind with that. Like what we do matters.
Yeah.
All right. There needs to be like a gazillion resources. If you have resources, put them in the chat. This is like an area I'm like, oh, we need to add like a whole bunch more here. I would say like anything like this, I think is like almost like required reading for the work we do. The Body Keeps the Score, just because it informs so much of this work. But anything also like Peter Levine has several books that I find super helpful. There's just like so many. David Emerson, and he's the same one that did the podcast. Or no, that's a different one. There's a bunch of them. So there was another author that with some of the other things came from. Yes.
We'll add all of those into the chat or into the email.
So we're going to add some additional resources because we need to add more. This is another resource, and this is a little card that you can print out to like keep with you. And it's for any kind of people doing work, any kind of helpers working with individuals impacted by trauma. So just reminders, things like sleep and exercise and self-care. Those are all things. Switching on and off, I think, is really important to consciously make the switch. So this became especially obvious to me when I started like during pandemic times and like working from home. I was not doing a great job of switching the flipping the switch because I was like always in this mode. I was like going in and out of like work stuff. And so whatever that practice is for you, like I like to like walk around in the grass barefoot, like tells me like, okay, I'm done with that. Like I'm done with that. Or I think automatically when I get in my car and just take a couple breaths, that's an easier one. But like, as long as you have some practices where you are conscientiously saying, I am closing this box, I am done with being in helper mode, and I'm going to allow myself to replenish, is really important. But this has more resources.
And this you can print out and put it in your wallet or put it in your folder, your Yoga for Change folder, whatever you take to class. So that PDF is printable. And
you can share it with other helping lovely humans. All right, what else we got? More resources. So there's a lot of resources at the end. Go back a slide for a second so I can mention the last. So the bottom one here is another training that I did for mindfulness and trauma from a more clinical perspective. So I know some people on here, obviously we're all yoga teachers, but some people on here maybe also work in mental health, either social workers, therapists, etc. If you are one of those persons and you would like to bring your mindfulness practices into a clinical perspective, that's what that last bit is. Cool. Yes, we are emailing this to you. Yes. Oh, you can't see anything you're talking. Yes, we are emailing you the slideshow. So yeah. Cool. All right. I love all of this. All right. And now where are we at? We got through. Okay. So we probably have time for one practice realistically. So I'm going to do a combo. I think it's going to be hard for you to do movement practice without getting set up. A smidgen of movement followed by a gratitude meditation. So we'll do a smidgen of movement. You don't need to go to your mat, stay in your chair, just a little bit of movement so we can get some of that in, because we've been sitting for a long time. Y'all, 4 hours, long time to be sitting. So we need some movement. All right, so you're going to start from whatever comfortable seated posture you're feeling. Take a full inhale and slow exhale. Maybe just a couple breaths, letting them flow naturally. On your next inhale, bring your shoulders up. Exhale them back and down. Feel that space open. Your sternum or on your collarbone. And then take your head from side to side. And any other movement that feels natural. So if it feels natural to do a little semicircle, to look up and down, or even full circles, if it feels good in your neck today. And if it feels pinchy or yucky, skip it. All right, coming back to stillness. On your next inhale, bring your arms all the way up, reaching long. And then exhale them down. Feel free to follow your own pace. You don't need to follow mine. Inhale up. Exhale down. All right, the next time you inhale up, let your breath flow naturally as you reach towards the ceiling. And you could reach one arm at a time or both arms together, whatever feels more natural in your body. On your next exhale, twist to one side, doesn't matter which. Your front hand can rest on your opposite knee. Your back arm is wherever it feels most supportive behind you. It could be right behind you, it could be on the back of the chair. As you're inhaling, your focus is on sitting tall. As you're exhaling, notice the twisting sensation at your center, maybe making little adjustments, kind of like you're wringing out a washcloth. On your next exhale, look back towards your back shoulder. Inhale your chin towards the front. Hello, exhale it back. On your next inhale, bring your back arm, cross it over your front arm. Now we have some options. Option to hold on to your knees and press back through your shoulder blades. If this feels like the stretch for you, you can stay here today. Another option, hold on to opposite arms or opposite shoulders. Wherever you have landed, whichever one you've chosen, as you inhale, expand that space between your shoulder blades. Exhale to release tension. Inhale, expand. Exhale, release. On your next inhale, open your arms wide. Option to bring them back or even look up. And then exhale, twist to the other side. All the same options, whatever feels most natural and supportive for you today. On your inhales, focus on lengthening. Each exhale, maybe you make a tiny adjustment to your twist, like a millimeter. Or maybe you're just noticing if and where you feel any sensations. On your next exhale, look back towards your back shoulder. Inhale your chin front. Exhale back. Inhale your back arm over. Make that X just like we did on the other side. And again, option to stay here. Option to hold on to opposite arms or opposite shoulders. Take a couple breaths wherever you have landed. And bring in a little thank you for yourself. Thank you for making some time to be here today. Inhale, arms out wide. Again, maybe you bring them back, looking up. Exhale, round your back, bring your hands towards your knees, and then a couple of cat-cows. Inhale to arch. Exhale to round. Inhale, arch. Exhale, round. Back to center. Take any other movement that you feel you need right now. Any other stretches or wiggles or anything. Take a moment for that before we settle in for a brief practice. And as we shift into this practice of stillness, remember you can practice with eyes open or eyes closed, whatever feels natural for you today. We're going to invite in a little bit of gratitude. So making space for gratitude to come up naturally. And if it doesn't, that's okay, just openness. And now focusing your awareness on your breath. So gratitude for having the lungs that are working in this moment, for having clean air to breathe. Shifting your awareness and gratitude to your heart that's beating, circulating. Gratitude for all of the organs that are working together in this moment to keep you alive. Now, gratitude and awareness for your entire body that brought you to this practice today. Gratitude for your brain and nervous system doing its best to keep you safe. And now, gratitude expanding to the whole group of beautiful humans that are here with us today. With each inhale, expanding gratitude. Each exhale, sending it outwards. And whenever you're ready, maybe move around a little bit, checking in with yourself, how you're feeling. And then checking in as a group as we are wrapping up this practice. How are we feeling, my friends? You have 2 minutes of group wisdom. So please, if you have anything to share, I know like we're at time. If anyone needs to leave, feel free to leave. If you want to stay after, if there's stuff you want to process, we will, keep this open long enough to process. Big, huge thank you for you all showing up on a Saturday and investing your time and such important knowledge and skills. So much love to all of you. And feel free to unmute if you have anything to share, any reflections, anythings.
And before we start to jump off, everyone, stick around. We do have a survey.
Oh yeah, the poll. I forgot. We should bring the poll up.
So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can.
I have a problematic hippocampus, my friends. I don't always remember.
What'd you call me? No, I'm just kidding. So no, I just want to say what a great job you all did. It was really, really, really good. There were 3 things specifically I wanted to mention that were effective: your ability to use your own experiences in this, your ability to allow everyone to share, and your ability to tie it into actually teaching yoga. All this crazy scientific mind shit. So good job with all 3 of those.
Yeah.
Thank you, Forrest. It was so great to see faces that I haven't seen in a while. This is so fun. I see Lauren. I see you there now too. I haven't seen you in a while. So super awesome to spend this time with you all. So the survey is there. Hopefully you saw it pop up on your screens. If you did not, I guess let either Alex or myself know. And I wonder if we could email something equivalent, maybe.
Yeah, we can. The Survey Monkey's there. So
okay,
if someone's not able to take this, then they're more than welcome to just send me like a little message and I see Janice's hand up. Is it for the iPad too? Before I get into that, I think the iPad, it should be at the top. There should be.
It just popped up for me.
Okay, cool.
My question was for like Yoga Alliance continuing education hours.
Yeah.
Is there a certain, because I've not entered a whole bunch of continuing education, I've entered in a lot of teaching. Will this pop up just under Yoga for Change, or do I need to put in a specific teacher?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe it's under Yoga for Change. I have to go in and just update the dates for it. I think the ones that are in there right now are for March. I will send out sometime next week. Everyone that was on this training will get a certificate of completion. And then you should be able to go in and enter that in and add Yoga for Change in there, and we can go in and verify you.
Perfect.
If you have a hard time finding the actual Trauma 101 training, just reach out to me and we'll make sure that you can get that in your Yoga Alliance hours. And if you're not Yoga Alliance, don't worry about it. You also don't need to be. I want to clarify that as well. There are some teachers that are, some that are not. So if you are not a part of Yoga Alliance, don't worry, don't panic. Nothing wrong there either.
Don't panic.
Yeah. Try not to panic.
I won't panic.